The multiverse had become quiet in ways that unsettled those who understood what silence meant at cosmic scales. After Infinite Frontier, after the Omniverse Declaration that reset boundaries and permissions, the space between realities, the bleed itself had achieved something resembling equilibrium. Not peace. Equilibrium. The distinction mattered to entities whose perception operated across dimensional strata. Crisis energy, that fundamental substrate of catastrophic change, still lingered in concentrations throughout the interstitial void. It pooled in eddies where universes had collided during the dark nights, where anti-monitor assaults had left scars in the fabric of existence itself. The energy didn't dissipate naturally. It couldn't. Crisis energy was to the multiverse what radiation was to a blast zone, persistent, transformative, dangerous in accumulated doses. The monitors had been tracking these pools with instruments that measured reality strain, the way seismographs measured tectonic stress. Their observation posts suspended in the bleed at coordinates that had no meaningful translation to three-dimensional space recorded fluctuations in the baseline distortion that underlay all of existence. For months following the linear verse deployment, that desperate framework designed to prevent timeline fragmentation, the readings had been declining, slowly, predictably. Following models that cosmic architects had calculated with precision that would make quantum physicists weep. Then the readings stopped declining. Monitor Rox Tal noticed it first during a routine scan of Sector 19 Aleph, a region where 3 separate crisis events had overlapped during the original Infinite Crisis. The energy signature there had been dropping by 0.03% per standard observation cycle for 17 cycles. Predictable. Documented. Then, between cycles 18 and 19, the drop was 0.08%. She ran the scan again. 0.12%. A third time, 0.17%. The energy wasn't just declining faster. It was accelerating in a curve that suggested external drainage rather than natural dispersal. Rox Tal expanded her scan radius, pulling data from 40 adjacent monitoring stations. The pattern repeated across all of them. Crisis energy throughout Sector 19 Aleph was being drawn toward a single point that her instruments couldn't properly resolve. The coordinates existed. The measurements confirmed spatial location. But when she attempted to establish visual observation, her systems returned contradictory data. The point was there. The point was nowhere. The point existed outside the standard parameters of bleed topology, while simultaneously occupying a specific location within it. She escalated to monitor Zillow-Vala. Zillow-Vala had survived the original crisis on Infinite Earths, had witnessed the reformation of the multiverse, had stood at the threshold when Perpetua's influence nearly unmade everything. Her experience with impossible phenomena was encyclopedic. She looked at Rox Tal's data for exactly 4 seconds before activating the emergency convocation protocol. Within what could loosely be called an hour time being a courtesy rather than a constant in the bleed, 17 monitors gathered at observation platform Sigma 7. They stood in a chamber that existed in 7 dimensions, simultaneously their forms adapting to perspectives that would have shattered human neurology on contact. "Show them," Zillow-Vala said. Rox Tal activated the main display. The visualization was a compromise, a translation of multidimensional phenomena into something that could be comprehended sequentially. It showed Sector 19 Aleph as a grid of light with crisis energy pools marked in deep crimson. Over the course of the playback, those pools began to shrink. Not evenly, not randomly. They contracted in vectors that all pointed toward a central coordinate. "The drainage rate is exponential," Rox Tal explained. "At current acceleration, Sector 19 Aleph will be completely clear of crisis energy in 8 cycles." Monitor Dax Novu leaned forward. "Clear crisis energy doesn't clear. It transforms or it migrates. But it doesn't simply vanish. I didn't say it vanishes, Roxtal corrected. I said it drains. The energy is being directed somewhere. Where? Another monitor asked. Roxtal highlighted the central coordinate. Here, except there is no here according to our instruments. The location exists, but it doesn't register as pocket dimension, as parallel Earth, or as any recognized form of spatial anomaly. Vala had been running her own analysis on a separate interface. She spoke without looking up. It's self-organizing. The chamber fell silent. Explain, Dax Novu said. Vaya transferred her data to the main display. The coordinate isn't a location in the traditional sense. It's a boundary. Something has created a closed system within the bleed, a space that interfaces with our reality, but operates under different fundamental rules. The crisis energy isn't being destroyed or transformed. It's being absorbed and sequestered. By what? Roxtal asked. Unknown. But it's methodical. Look at the absorption pattern. Vala expanded the visualization. The crimson pools didn't just shrink, they organized themselves into spirals as they drained, forming geometric patterns that suggested intentional design rather than natural phenomena. This isn't a rift. This isn't a breach. This is construction. Monitor Tharakul, who specialized in extra-dimensional incursions, spoke for the first time. Have we attempted to probe the boundary directly? No, Zilovaya said. I wanted consensus before we risk contact. Contact implies threat, Tharakul said. Has this phenomenon demonstrated hostility? It's removing crisis energy from the multiverse. Dax Novu pointed out. That's the opposite of hostile. Or, it's preparation, Tharakul countered. Entities don't drain crisis energy unless they intend to use it or unless they're being damaged by its presence. Either scenario suggests something that doesn't belong in our reality. Zilovaya finally looked up from her instruments. There's another possibility. It might be doing exactly what it appears to be doing, cleaning up the mess we've failed to clean up ourselves. Then it's acting without authorization, Tharakul said. The multiverse doesn't require external custodians. Perhaps it does now, Zilovaya said quietly. The debate would have continued, but Roxtal's instruments began emitting a harmonic tone that made several monitors physically recoil. On the main display, the central coordinate had changed. The boundary was no longer just absorbing energy. It was manifesting. The visualization couldn't properly render what was happening. The displays showed contradictory images, superimposed over each other, a sphere that was also a plane, a void that emitted light, a structure that expanded while remaining the same size. But through all the contradictions, one element remained consistent. Something had arrived in the bleed, not through a portal, not via dimensional transit. It was simply present in a way that suggested it had always been there, and had only just decided to become observable. The crisis energy in Sector 19 Aleph wasn't draining anymore. It was gone. Absorbed so completely that not even residual traces remained. The sector registered cleaner than it had been before the original crisis, before Infinite Frontier, before any of the catastrophes that had scarred the multiverse. And at the center of that impossible cleanliness, the anomaly waited. Zilovala ran every scan available to monitor technology. Mass readings returned errors. Energy signatures fluctuated between 0 and infinity. Dimensional origin came back as null. It was as if the universe itself couldn't decide whether the thing existed or not. and had settled on acknowledging its presence, all SARS, while refusing to categorize it. "What is it?" Roxtal whispered. Zilovala stared at the readings for a long moment before answering. "It's something that doesn't require our permission to exist." Dax Novu turned to face the assembled monitors. "Monitors, we need to establish whether this represents a threat to multiverse stability." "It's already demonstrated impact on multiverse stability," Tharakul said. "It's altering crisis energy distribution without oversight. That's direct interference with cosmic architecture." "It's cleaning up our failures," Zilovaya said again, more firmly this time. "Maybe we should consider the possibility that this isn't an invasion. It's just something that exists outside our framework and is solving problems we couldn't solve." "Nothing exists outside our framework," Tharakul said. "That's the definition of framework." But even as he said it, every monitor in the chamber knew it was false. They'd witnessed too many impossibilities, endured too many crises that redefined what was supposed to be possible. The multiverse had rules until it didn't. It had boundaries until something ignored them. And now something had arrived that made the instruments question their own measurements. On Earth Zero, in a subterranean facility beneath Gotham Bay, Batman stood in front of a bank of monitors that showed absolutely nothing unusual. Metropolis was quiet. Central City's Speed Force readings were normal. Atlantis reported standard tidal patterns. The world was by all observable metrics fine. He trusted the readouts less than he trusted the feeling in his gut that said otherwise. Oracle's voice came through the comm. "You're staring at normal readings, like they personally offended you." "They're too normal," Batman said. "That's called paranoia. That's called pattern recognition. After Infinite Frontier, we've had minor disturbances every 3 to 4 weeks. Bleed fluctuations, reality stress markers, temporal echo events. It's been consistent for months." "And now it's stopped," Oracle said. "Which could mean the multiverse is finally stabilizing like it's supposed to. Or it means something is masking the disturbances." Oracle was quiet for a moment. "You're reaching." "Maybe." Batman zoomed in on a data stream from the Justice League's cosmic monitoring satellites. The readings showed a slight decline in ambient crisis energy across multiple sectors. Slight, barely measurable. The kind of change that would look like statistical noise to anyone not specifically looking for it. He was always specifically looking for it. "Pull the readings from the last 72 hours, Batman said. "Cross-reference with monitor activity reports if we have access." "We don't have access," Oracle reminded him. "The monitors don't exactly file public reports." "Then query the Watchtower's deep space sensors. If something's changing in the bleed, there should be gravitational echoes." Oracle sighed, but started the query. "You know what Alfred would say about this, right? That I should sleep more and catastrophize less." Close enough. But Batman didn't look away from the monitors, because somewhere in ways the instruments couldn't properly measure the universe had gotten lighter. Not brighter, not louder, just lighter, as if some vast weight had been partially lifted from reality itself. And nobody seemed to notice, except him. Back in the bleed, the monitors had reached a tentative consensus. They would observe, they would document. They would not engage directly until they understood what they were dealing with. Zilovala, overruled but not silenced, watched the anomaly on her private instruments. It hadn't moved. It hadn't expanded. It simply existed in its impossible space, having already accomplished more crisis energy remediation in hours than the monitors had managed in months. She thought about framework, about how the universe was supposed to work, about all the times the universe had violated its own rules and forced everyone to adapt. The anomaly didn't look threatening. It didn't look like anything. It just was in a way that suggested being was enough. And in a closed space that existed sideways to the bleed in a dimension that followed rules. Written in a language the DC multiverse couldn't read. Rimuru, Tempest, observed his surroundings with the detached curiosity of someone who had accidentally stepped into a stranger's home and was trying to decide whether to apologize or introduce himself. Ciel's voice resonated in his consciousness. Analysis complete. This reality operates on a crisis-based evolutionary model. The energy you absorbed was residual from multiple extinction-level events. The local architecture appears designed to periodically destabilize and reconstitute itself. Seems inefficient, Rimuru thought back. Inefficient but stable within parameters. The system has survived numerous total collapse scenarios. It has adapted. So have we, Rimuru noted. Which is probably why we're going to be a problem? Correction, we are already a problem. Local observers have detected our presence. They are debating threat assessment protocols. Rimuru considered that. He'd encountered gods, demon lords, and cosmic entities that operated on scales that made planets look like dust motes. He'd learned to read the signatures of power to distinguish between genuine threats and territorial posturing. These observers felt more like the latter, concerned, uncertain, not immediately hostile. Let them watch, Rimuru decided. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need to figure out how to synchronize with this reality's base structure before imaginary space starts having compatibility problems. Recommendation: avoid direct contact until synchronization is complete. This reality's fundamental forces operate on different principles than ours. Interaction could cause unpredictable cascade effects. Noted. How long until synchronization? Unknown. The local physics are argumentative. Rimuru felt something that might have been amusement if he still processed emotions the way humans did. Argumentative physics. That's a new one. This reality appears to function through narrative causality overlaid on quantum mechanics. The more impossible an event, the more likely it is to occur if it serves thematic purpose. So they run on dramatic irony? Essentially, yes. Rimuru settled deeper into imaginary space, letting Ciel handle the background processing while he observed the structure of this strange new reality. It was louder than his home universe, more chaotic. But there was an order to the chaos, a pattern that suggested someone somewhere was desperately trying to maintain control over a system that had learned to thrive on its own instability. He didn't envy them the job. In the bleed, the crisis energy continued to drain. Not violently, not catastrophically, just steadily, methodically, as something that didn't belong, began the slow process of making itself comfortable in a universe that hadn't invited it, but couldn't seem to refuse it entry. The multiverse, for its part, continued to exist. A little lighter, a little confused, and entirely unaware that the quiet anomaly in Sector 19 Aleph had just redefined what outside the framework actually meant. The debate had been ongoing for what the monitors measured as 6 cycles, though time remained a courtesy rather than a constant in the bleed. What began as cautious observation had fractured into ideological camps, each convinced their interpretation of the anomaly represented the only rational response to an unprecedented phenomenon. Monitor Thara Kul stood at the center of the chamber, his form rigid with conviction. We're discussing this as if inaction is acceptable. An external entity has established itself within the bleed, without permission, without negotiation, without any acknowledgement of multiverse sovereignty. That's not coexistence. That's colonization. Colonization implies expansion, Zillow Vala countered from her position near the observation displays. The entity has occupied exactly one coordinate. It hasn't grown. It hasn't replicated. It exists in a closed system that doesn't interact with our reality, beyond absorbing excess crisis energy. Yet, Thorakul said, it hasn't expanded yet. We have no data on its intentions, no framework for predicting its behavior. All we have is an anomaly that violates every principle of dimensional physics and a hypothesis that it might be benign. Dax Novu, who had maintained neutrality throughout the earlier discussions, finally spoke. Zillow Vaya raises a valid point. The entity has had multiple cycles to demonstrate hostility. Instead, it's performed what amounts to environmental remediation. Sector 19 Aleph is cleaner now than it's been since before the first crisis, which proves sophistication, not benevolence, Thorakul shot back. An entity capable of sequestering crisis energy at that scale possesses power that rivals Perpetua's influence. We cannot afford to wait until it decides to demonstrate that power offensively. Roxtal had been monitoring the anomaly's readings throughout the debate. She interjected without looking up from her instruments. The energy signature is changing again. Every monitor in the chamber turned toward her display. The visualization showed the anomaly's boundary, that impossible membrane between the closed system and the bleed proper. For 6 cycles, it had remained static, present, but inert. Now, subtle fluctuations were propagating across its surface. Is it expanding? Thorakul demanded. No, Roxtal said. It's consolidating. The boundary is becoming more defined. Whatever exists inside that space is establishing a more permanent interface with our reality. Zillow Vaya studied the patterns. It's synchronizing, adapting its internal structure to match bleed physics at the connection points while maintaining independence internally. That's not aggressive behavior. That's careful integration. Or preparation, Thorakul said. Establishing a stable foothold before the next phase. The debate would have continued in circles, as such debates always did when dealing with cosmic scale unknowns. But a presence made itself known in the chamber that silenced all discussion immediately. It wasn't a physical arrival. Perpetua was gone. Her influence shattered during the Infinite Frontier resolution. But echoes remained fragments of her consciousness, her will. Her absolute certainty that the multiverse existed to serve specific purposes, and anything that deviated from those purposes represented corruption. The echo manifested as a harmonic in the chamber's dimensional field, a frequency that made the monitor's perceptions shudder. It carried no words, no specific instructions, just an impression wrongness, deviation, threat. Thorakul seized on it immediately. Even Perpetua's remnants recognize the danger. This entity represents a fundamental disruption to cosmic order. Perpetua's remnants recognize difference, Zillow Vaya said, but her voice carried less certainty now. That doesn't automatically translate to threat. Dax Novu gestured toward the readings. The echo is growing stronger. It's resonating with something in the 6th dimension. The 6th dimension, the control room of the multiverse, where fundamental forces were designed and deployed. If Perpetua's influence was awakening there, it meant the anomaly was being classified as a crisis-level event by the deepest layers of reality's architecture. Thorakul pressed his advantage. We can't ignore this. The multiverse itself is registering alarm. We need to establish parameters, determine capabilities, assess threat level. We need containment protocols. Containment, Zilovala repeated slowly. You want to cage something we don't understand. I want to establish control over something that currently operates without oversight. Tharakul corrected. There's a difference between imprisonment and responsible management. Monitor Novu Rel, who had been silent throughout most of the deliberation, finally spoke. Her specialty was crisis prediction pattern analysis that identified cascade points before they triggered. If we initiate containment protocols, we risk triggering exactly the kind of defensive response we're trying to avoid. Unknown entities with significant power don't typically respond well to aggression. Then we don't approach it as aggression, Tharakul said. We approach it as analysis, a passive scan of the closed system. No direct contact, no interference with internal structure, just measurement. If the entity is truly non-hostile, it won't object to observation. And if it does object, Zilovaya asked, then we have our answer about its intentions. The logic was circular and dangerous, but Perpetua's echo continued to resonate through the chamber, amplifying the sense that action, any action, was preferable to continued passivity. The monitors had survived by maintaining control by understanding and categorizing every element of the multiverse under their stewardship. The anomaly represented a gap in that understanding, and gaps were where crises began. After another full cycle of debate, the consensus formed not through agreement, but through exhaustion. They would implement a low-level containment protocol, passive scanning only no direct penetration of the boundary. They would gather data, establish baselines, determine whether the entity posed genuine risk or merely existed outside their comfortable parameters. Zilovila voted against the measure, but was overruled 7-3. Tharakul began preparations immediately. The scanning array was delicate work designed to probe the anomaly's closed system without triggering defensive responses. It operated on principles borrowed from source wall analysis, where observation had to be conducted through layers of dimensional buffering to avoid contaminating the data with the observer's presence. The instruments were positioned at coordinates surrounding the anomaly in a perfect geometric pattern. Each scanner would emit a pulse of structured energy, not enough to damage or disrupt, just enough to map the internal architecture of whatever existed inside that impossible boundary. Roxtal supervised the deployment. Scanners in position, energy levels nominal, initiating scan sequence in 3, 2, 1. The pulses launched simultaneously, converging on the anomaly from multiple vectors. For exactly 2 seconds, the instruments functioned as designed. They recorded dimensional depth energy compositions, spatial topology. The data was strange, contradictory in ways that suggested the internal space operated on non-Euclidean principles, but recordable. Then, something noticed. The scanners didn't explode or malfunction. They simply stopped receiving data. The return signals vanished, as if absorbed by a perfect void. And in that moment of silence, something changed in the quality of the anomaly's presence. It had been passive before existing, without exerting influence beyond its immediate boundary. Now it was attentive. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable, like the shift in air pressure before a storm. Zilovvala felt it first. Shut it down. We're not getting readings yet, Tharakul said. Give it another. Shut it down now. But it was already too late. The scanners had touched something inside the closed system that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Not a defense mechanism. Not a security system. Something more fundamental. On Roxtal's displays, new readings began appearing. The anomaly wasn't just absorbing the scanning pulses, it was analyzing them. Reverse engineering the dimensional signature of the instruments themselves, tracing the connection back to their origin points. understanding in seconds what the monitors had spent cycles debating. It knew it was being studied, and more concerning it now, understood how the monitor's technology functioned. Tharakul watched the data with growing alarm. It's learning from the scan. Of course it is. Zilovaya said, her voice tight with frustration. We just introduced ourselves by attempting surveillance. What did you think would happen? Inside imaginary space, Sayel's alert pulled Rimuru out of his passive observation of the local cosmology. External intrusion detected, multiple probes attempting dimensional analysis of containment structure. Rimuru processed the information with the calm that came from having survived genuinely existential threats. Probes, not weapons. Correct. Analysis suggests reconnaissance rather than assault. However, the probes are attempting to map internal architecture. They've made contact with the outer layers of imaginary space. That got Rimuru's attention. Imaginary space wasn't just storage, it was sanctuary. It contained the preserved souls of everyone he'd absorbed, every ally he'd lost, and kept safe within his being. The idea of external forces treating it as analyzable data triggered something deeper than irritation. Can they actually penetrate it? He asked. No. Their technology operates on principles incompatible with imaginary space's construction. But the attempt itself is problematic. They're treating our existence as a puzzle to solve, rather than a presence to communicate with. Rimuru considered that. He'd been patient maintaining strict limits on his interaction with this reality, while Ciel worked on synchronization. He'd absorbed the excess crisis energy, not as an act of aggression, but as simple cleanup, the dimensional equivalent of wiping mud off his shoes before entering someone's home. He'd made no demands issued, no threats existed as quietly as something of his nature could exist. And their response was surveillance. They're scared, Rimuru observed. Agreed. Analysis of probe design suggests defensive motivation rather than offensive preparation. They don't know what we are, so they're attempting to establish parameters. By poking at imaginary space. Yes. Rimuru made a decision that Ciel would later classify as the pivotal moment when de-escalation became impossible. Show them why that's a bad idea. Ciel didn't argue. She understood the principle boundaries needed to be clear. Deploying response, non-lethal, informational only. The monitor's scanners didn't fail. They were returned. Every probe, every pulse of analytical energy came back to its origin point, but changed. The data they carried was no longer about the anomaly. It was about the scanners themselves. Complete technical specifications, design flaws underlying physics, all presented in a format that made it clear. We understand your technology better than you do. We could have done anything to these instruments. We chose to simply send them home. Tharakul stared at his instruments in something approaching shock. It reverse-engineered the entire scanning array. In seconds. Roxtal added, her voice hollow. It analyzed, comprehended, and surpassed our technology in the time it took us to realize we'd made contact. Zilovaya would have felt vindicated if the situation weren't so alarming. Now it knows we're here. It knows we're watching. And it knows we tried to probe its internal structure. So the question becomes, what does it do with that information? The answer came faster than anyone expected. The anomaly's boundaries shifted. Not expanding, Zilovala had been correct about that. But the quality of its presence changed. It was no longer just existing in parallel to the bleed. It was actively maintaining separation, deliberately keeping itself distinct from DC's cosmology. Before it had been like a guest trying not to disturb the furniture. Now it was like a guest who'd just locked their bedroom door. On Earth Zero, Batman's instruments finally registered something concrete. A spike in dimensional stress markers localized to a region of the bleed that his sensors barely had resolution to detect. It lasted less than a second, but the signature was unlike anything in the database. He opened a channel to the watchtower. "This is Batman. I need John Stewart at the monitor board." Green Lantern's voice came back 30 seconds later. "I'm here. What am I looking for?" "Bleed disturbance. Coordinates uploading now. Can you get a reading from the central power battery?" There was a pause while Stewart consulted with Oa. "The Guardians are saying nothing. No record of any Lantern activity in that sector. But there's a notation in the Book of Oa about a region being flagged for observation. Flagged when? 6 hours ago. No explanation attached." Batman pulled up the timeline. 6 hours ago was when the normal disturbance patterns had stopped, when the universe had gotten lighter. "The Guardians don't flag regions without cause." "No," Stewart agreed. "They don't." Back in the bleed, the monitors convened emergency session. Perpetua's echo had grown stronger, resonating now with something in the dark multiverse, that nightmare realm where failed realities festered. The combined harmonic created a feedback loop of alarm that made rational analysis nearly impossible. Tharakul stood at the center of the chamber, vindicated but grim. "The entity has demonstrated active defense capability and information warfare capacity that exceeds our own. We can no longer classify this as benign presence. We need escalated protocols." "Escalated how?" Dax Novu asked. "We've already attempted analysis and been rebuffed." "What's the next step? Direct confrontation?" "Controlled containment," Tharakul said. "Not imprisonment. Isolation. We establish a barrier that prevents expansion while we determine the entity's nature and purpose." Zillow Vala looked at him with something close to pity. "You're going to cage something that just proved it understands our technology better than we do. You're going to build a prison for an entity that exists in a closed system we can't properly measure. And you think that ends well?" "I think doing nothing ends worse," Tharakul said. "If we wait until it decides to act, we lose all initiative. We need to establish control while we still can." "We never had control," Zilovaya said quietly. "We just convinced ourselves we did." But the vote when it came went against her. 9-1. The monitors would proceed with isolation protocols. They would ring the anomaly with containment fields. Establish a quarantine zone, prevent any possibility of expansion or interaction with the broader multiverse. They would in essence declare that the anomaly was a problem that required management, rather than a presence that required understanding. Zilovaya watched the preparations begin and thought about all the times the multiverse had been nearly destroyed by entities that felt threatened, cornered, pushed into defensive positions, from which the only exit was violence. She thought about crisis events and how many of them could have been prevented with communication instead of confrontation. She thought about how the monitors had become so focused on maintaining order that they'd forgotten order was only valuable if it served the beings who lived within it. And she thought about the anomaly sitting in its closed space, having just learned that the local authorities viewed its existence as something to contain rather than something to welcome. The isolation protocols would take 3 cycles to deploy. 3 cycles during which the anomaly would be watched, measured, and prepared for imprisonment. 3 cycles during which it would have every reason to decide that cooperation was a mistake. Inside imaginary space, Rimuru listened to Ciel's analysis of the scanning attempt and its aftermath. "They're going to try to cage us." "Affirmative. Dimensional signature analysis suggests they're preparing containment architecture. Timeline for deployment approximately 72 hours by local measurement standards. Do they understand that won't work? Unknown. Their technology is sophisticated, but operates under assumptions that don't apply to our construction. They may believe containment is possible. Rimuru settled deeper into his observation. The limits he'd maintained, the careful restrictions on his presence, the deliberate restraint had been predicated on the assumption that this reality would eventually adapt to his existence the way most realities did. With wariness, perhaps. With caution, certainly. But with eventual acceptance once it became clear he wasn't interested in conquest or destruction. Instead, they were treating him like a virus to quarantine. How long until synchronization is complete? He asked. At current rate, 4 days. However, if they deploy containment fields, the interference may extend that timeline significantly. And if they actually make contact with imaginary space during deployment. CL was quiet for a moment. Then synchronization becomes irrelevant. We would need to respond. Response parameters, defensive only. Demonstrate that containment is futile without causing lasting damage to their infrastructure. Make it clear that we cannot be caged, but we're not interested in conflict. They'll interpret that as a threat. They're already interpreting our existence as a threat, CL pointed out. At least this way, the terms are explicit. Rimuru thought about Tempest, about the careful diplomacy required to build a nation from nothing, about all the times he'd had to balance strength with restraint to avoid wars that would have benefited no one. He'd learned patience over years of dealing with entities that viewed power as permission and restraint as weakness. But he'd also learned that sometimes boundaries needed to be enforced. Let them deploy their containment, he decided. When it fails, maybe they'll be ready to talk instead of trying to analyze us like a lab specimen. And if they escalate further, Rimuru didn't answer immediately. He thought about the souls in imaginary space, about CL's presence, about everything he'd built and protected across multiple realities. He thought about limits and what happened when limits became liabilities. Then we show them what existing outside their framework actually means. He said finally, not as a threat, as education. In the bleed, the isolation protocols continued their deployment. Massive containment structures materialized at strategic coordinates, each one a marvel of monitor technology designed to create impassable barriers between dimensional spaces. And in the closed system, they surrounded something that had arrived accidentally and intended to leave peacefully, began making different kinds of preparations. The multiverse, for its part, grew quieter still, not lighter this time. Just quiet in the way air becomes still before a storm. The monitors didn't notice. They were too focused on their instruments, their protocols, their absolute certainty that they were doing what needed to be done to protect reality from an unknown threat. They didn't consider that sometimes the threat came not from the unknown, but from the response to it. 3 cycles remained until deployment. It wouldn't be enough time to prevent what came next. The containment field generators materialized around the anomaly in perfect geometric alignment. Each one a construct of crystallized dimensional mathematics that would have taken a terrestrial civilization millennia to conceptualize. The monitors had deployed them in stages over 2.5 cycles, building the cage layer by layer, while the anomaly remained motionless within its closed system. Tharakul monitored the deployment from platform Sigma 7, watching as the final generator locked into position. The field wouldn't activate until all components were synchronized. Premature activation would create gaps that something sufficiently sophisticated might exploit. But once complete, the barrier would create an absolute separation between the anomaly's space and the bleed proper. Not destruction, not elimination, just isolation quarantine control. Final generator in position, Roxtal reported. Running synchronization checks now. Zillow Vala stood at her station, having been overruled but not dismissed. She'd spent the deployment cycles running probability models, trying to predict how an entity that had already demonstrated technological superiority would respond to imprisonment. None of her models ended without escalation. "You're still going through with this," she said to Tharakul. It wasn't a question. "We're establishing necessary boundaries," he replied without looking at her. The entity has had ample time to communicate if communication was its intention. Its silence suggests either inability or unwillingness to engage with multiverse authority. Or it suggests we haven't given it reason to believe communication would be productive. Zillow Vala countered. "We responded to its presence with surveillance. When that failed, we responded with containment. At what point did we attempt actual dialogue?" "Dialogue requires mutual language," Tharakul said. "We have no framework for communication with something that operates outside dimensional physics as we understand them." "Then perhaps we should have built one instead of building a prison." Before Tharakul could respond, Roxtal's instruments emitted a harmonic that made every monitor in the chamber turn toward her displays. The synchronization check had revealed something unexpected. "The generators are calibrated," she said slowly, "but there's interference in the resonance pattern. Something's affecting the quantum entanglement between units." "Malfunction?" Dax Novu asked. "No, external influence. The anomaly is observing the field construction." Tharakul leaned toward the display. "Can it disrupt the synchronization?" "Unknown. But it's definitely aware of what we're building. And it's analyzing the architecture in real time." Inside Imaginary Space, CL had completed her assessment of the containment field 3 cycles before the monitors finished deploying it. She'd mapped every generator, calculated. Every force vector understood the underlying principles with the kind of thoroughness that came from processing information at scales that made quantum computing look like an abacus. "They're attempting dimensional severance," she informed Rimuru. "The field is designed to create a hard boundary between our space and theirs. Once activated, no energy transfer, no dimensional overlap, no possibility of expansion." "Will it work?" Rimuru asked. "Against a conventional pocket dimension or parallel Earth, yes. Against imaginary space, no. Their field operates on the assumption that space can be contained by controlling its connection points to external reality. Imaginary space doesn't have connection points in the traditional sense. It exists independently of external dimensional architecture." Rimuru processed that. "So, when they activate the field, it will fail to establish containment. But the attempt itself is problematic." How problematic? CL's response carried an edge that would have been concern if she still processed emotions. "The field generators are designed to map the internal structure of whatever they're containing. It's an automatic process they need to understand what they're isolating to maintain stable barriers. When they attempt that mapping on imaginary space, they'll be probing every layer, every stored entity, every preserved soul." That changed the equation entirely. Rimuru had tolerated surveillance of his external presence. He'd accepted their fear as natural response to the unknown. But imaginary space wasn't just his storage facility. It was sanctuary for beings who trusted him with their continued existence. The idea of external forces treating those souls as data points to analyze triggered something deeper than strategic calculation. "Can you prevent the mapping without destroying the generators?" he asked. "Yes, but preventing it will require active interference with their technology. They'll interpret that as hostile action. They're already treating us as hostile. At least this way, the boundaries are explicit. CL began preparations. The response would need to be calibrated perfectly, forceful enough to make the point clear, restrained enough to avoid triggering the kind of escalation that led to genuine conflict. She dealt with similar situations before back in the Tensura universe, when nations had attempted to probe Tempest's defenses. The principle was the same: demonstrate capability without causing lasting harm. On Platform Sigma 7, the final synchronization checks completed. Every generator showed green status. The field was ready for activation. All systems nominal. Rox Tal confirmed. Field integrity at 99.6%, within acceptable parameters for deployment. Thera Cool initiated the activation sequence. Engaging containment field in 3, 2, 1. The generators pulsed simultaneously, releasing waves of structured energy that converged on the anomaly from multiple vectors. The field began to form a barrier of crystallized space-time that would separate the closed system from the bleed. Isolate it completely, make it something that could be studied at leisure without risk of expansion or interference. For exactly 4 seconds, the field functioned as designed. Then something inside the closed system responded. The generators didn't explode. They didn't malfunction. They simply stopped working. Every single unit simultaneously experienced what the monitor's instruments could only describe as voluntary shutdown. The containment field collapsed before it fully formed, and the energy meant to create barriers dissipated harmlessly into the bleed. But that wasn't what alarmed the monitors most. What alarmed them was the data that came back from those 4 seconds when the field had been active. Rox Tal stared at her readings with something approaching horror. It didn't just disable the generators, it reverse-engineered the entire containment protocol. Complete field specifications, activation sequences underlying dimensional mathematics. And it did something to the mapping subroutines. What kind of something? Theracool demanded. The generators were designed to map internal structure as part of the containment process. When they attempted to scan the anomaly's interior, they encountered defenses. Not violent, not destructive, just absolute. The mapping routines were returned with a message embedded in their code. A message, madam. Zillow Vaya moved closer to the display. What does it say? Rox Tal brought up the data. It wasn't text, not in any conventional sense. It was information structured in a way that bypassed language, entirely conveying meaning through pure conceptual transfer. Every monitor who viewed it understood it instantly and completely. The space you attempted to analyze contains beings under my protection. Your instruments would have treated them as data. That is unacceptable. This is not hostility. This is boundary enforcement. Do not attempt this again. The chamber fell silent. Not because the message was threatening, it wasn't. It was matter-of-fact, almost clinical in its delivery. The silence came from the implications. The entity hadn't just defended itself, it had defended others. It had demonstrated protective instinct, ethical considerations, and the capability to communicate those considerations in a format the monitors could understand. It had also demonstrated the ability to completely neutralize their containment technology, while simultaneously analyzing and comprehending it in real time. Dax Novu spoke first. It's protecting something inside that space. Beings, it said. Not resources, not territory. Beings. Which means it's not a mindless phenomenon, Zillow Vala added. It's sapient. It has priorities. It distinguishes between acceptable and unacceptable actions. And it just told us where the line is. Tharakul was staring at the failed containment field with an expression that would have been disbelief on a less disciplined monitor. It disabled 17 field generators simultaneously. That should be impossible. Each unit operates on independent power sources with randomized activation sequences to prevent coordinated attacks. Clearly, it's not impossible, Zilovaya said. It's just impossible for us. The implications settled over the chamber like a weight. They hadn't just failed to contain the anomaly. They'd revealed the limits of their own technology, while the entity had revealed virtually nothing about its actual capabilities beyond what was necessary to enforce its boundaries. And worse, they'd provoked it. Not into violence, but into active defense. The anomaly was no longer passively existing in its closed system. It was now aware of them as a potential threat, and had demonstrated both the capability and willingness to protect itself. On Earth 0, Batman's instruments registered the containment field's collapse. The energy signature was distinct enough that every major power on the planet with cosmic monitoring capability would have detected it, which meant he had maybe 30 minutes before Superman showed up at the cave asking questions. He opened a priority channel to the watchtower. "This is Batman. I need an emergency session. Now." "Define emergency," Cyborg's voice came back. The monitors just tried to contain something in the bleed. It failed. Spectacularly. There was a pause. How spectacularly? The kind of spectacular that suggests whatever they tried to contain is significantly more capable than they are. "I'll convene the League." Inside imaginary space, Rimuru reviewed CL's defense actions with a detached assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate conflicts without emotional investment. The response had been calibrated perfectly, forceful enough to establish clear boundaries, restrained enough to avoid causing permanent damage to the monitor's technology. But he knew how these situations developed. He'd seen it before in the Tensura universe, when nations encountered something they couldn't control. First came observation, then came attempted containment, then came escalation as fear and uncertainty drove increasingly aggressive responses. "They're going to try something else," he said. "Affirmative," CL confirmed. "Probability analysis suggests they'll interpret our defense as a confirmation of threat status. Their next action will likely involve more aggressive protocols." "How aggressive?" "Unknown. Their technology operates within constraints we don't fully understand yet, but they've demonstrated willingness to deploy force preemptively. And we've just proven their current force deployment is inadequate." Rimuru considered that. Back in Tempest, when he'd first established his nation, there had been a period of careful negotiation with surrounding powers. Some had accepted his existence peacefully. Others had required demonstration that aggression would be counterproductive. He'd learned to distinguish between entities that could be reasoned with and entities that only understood strength. The question was, which category did the monitors fall into? "How long until synchronization is complete?" he asked. 3 days local measurement. Possibly longer if they continue interference attempts. "And if they deploy something more dangerous before then?" Shell was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll need to expand our response parameters. Not to cause harm, but to make continued interference untenable." "Define untenable." "Make them understand that every action they take against us will fail not through violence, but through fundamental incompatibility between their technology and our existence. Demonstrate that we cannot be contained, controlled, or eliminated through any mechanism they currently possess." Rimuru thought about the souls in imaginary space. About Shion Benamaru Shuna, all the citizens of Tempest, who existed as preserved consciousnesses within his being after various conflicts. about the responsibility that came with being strong enough to protect, but not so arrogant as to provoke unnecessary conflict. Set defense parameters to active, he decided. No preemptive action, but if they attempt another breach, we respond immediately and comprehensively. Make it clear that imaginary space is off limits. Everything else is negotiable. Understood. Defensive protocols updated. Back on Platform Sigma-7, the monitors convened Emergency Council. Perpetua's echo had grown stronger, resonating now with something deep in the dark multiverse. The combined harmonic created a feedback loop that made rational analysis difficult, amplifying every alarm signal, every threat assessment, every instinct that said the anomaly represented existential danger. Tharakul stood at the center of the chamber, his certainty shaken but not broken. The entity has demonstrated active hostility. It demonstrated defense, Zilovaya corrected. There's a difference. It disabled our containment field and embedded what amounts to a threat in our technology. That's not passive defense, that's a show of force. It was a boundary enforcement, Zilovaya said. It told us explicitly what it won't tolerate attempts to analyze the beings it protects. Everything else was demonstration of capability, not threat of use. Dax Novu studied the data from the failed containment. The message was clear. It won't allow us to probe its internal structure, but it didn't attack us. It didn't damage our equipment permanently. It could have done both. Which means it's either genuinely non-hostile or sophisticated enough to maintain the appearance of non-hostility while preparing more aggressive action, Tharakul said. We can't know which until it's too late. Monitor Novu Rel. The crisis predictor finally spoke. We're at a cascade point. Our next action determines whether this becomes manageable situation or catastrophic event. If we escalate further, we risk triggering exactly the kind of defensive response that turns accidents into wars. And if we do nothing, Tharakul countered, we risk allowing something potentially dangerous to establish permanent presence in our multiverse without oversight or control. It's already established permanent presence, Zilovaya pointed out. The question is whether we accept that and attempt communication, or continue treating it as a problem to solve through force. The debate would have continued, but Roxtal's instruments registered a new development. The anomaly's boundary was changing again, not expanding as Tharakul had feared. But the quality of its separation from the bleed was becoming more absolute. Where before it had been like a closed door, now it was becoming like a sealed vault. It's reinforcing its isolation, Roxtal reported. The boundary is becoming less permeable. It's hardening its defenses. Because we attacked it, Zilovaya said quietly. We attempted containment, Tharakul corrected. It experienced our containment attempt as attack, and now it's responding by making itself harder to reach. We're creating exactly the isolation we claim to want, except now it's on the entity's terms instead of ours. Dax Novu looked at the readings with growing concern. If it completes this reinforcement, we may lose the ability to communicate, even if we wanted to. It will exist in our reality, but be completely separate from it. A permanent anomaly that we can observe, but never understand or interact with. That might be preferable to the alternative, Tharakul said. What alternative? Zilovaya asked. Continued escalation until one of us breaks. We've already proven our technology can't contain it. What makes you think we can threaten it into submission? Before Tharakul could answer, every instrument in the chamber registered simultaneous alert. Something was happening in the sixth dimension, that control room of the multiverse where fundamental forces were designed and deployed. Perpetua's echo, which had been growing steadily stronger, suddenly spiked to levels that made the chamber's dimensional field shudder. But it wasn't just the echo anymore. Something else was responding to the anomaly's presence, something built into the deepest layers of the multiverse's architecture. Crisis energy, that fundamental substrate of catastrophic change, was beginning to move. Not randomly, not naturally. It was being drawn toward the anomaly, like water finding a drain. "It's happening again," Roxtal said, her voice tight. "Like Sector 19 Aleph, but faster. The anomaly is absorbing crisis energy, but this time it's pulling from the 6th dimension directly." Thara Kul stared at the readings. "That's not possible. Crisis energy in the 6th dimension is stabilized, controlled, isolated from external influence. Apparently, the anomaly doesn't recognize the difference between stabilized and unstabilized energy," Zilovaya observed. "It's treating all crisis energy as something to sequester regardless of where it's stored." The implications were staggering. If the entity could drain crisis energy from the 6th dimension, the control room, the foundation level of the multiverse's architecture, then nothing was truly isolated from its influence. It could reach into the deepest structures of reality and take what it wanted without asking permission. Dax Novu turned to Thara Kul. "We need to stop, now, before this escalates beyond recovery." "Stop?" Thara Kul looked at him. "It's draining energy from the 6th dimension. That's not defense. That's aggression. That's response to our aggression," Zilovaya said. "We tried to cage it. It responded by making itself harder to reach. We interpreted that as threat. Now it's securing resources to ensure we can't threaten what it protects. Every action we take makes the situation worse." "Then what do you suggest?" Thara Kul demanded. "Surrender, accept that something foreign has established itself in our reality and we have no recourse." "I suggest," Zilovaya said carefully, "that we stop treating this as a war and start treating it as first contact. Because right now, we're failing spectacularly at both." The chamber fell silent. Crisis energy continued to drain from the 6th dimension. The anomaly continued to reinforce its boundaries. And the monitors, for the first time in countless cycles, faced the genuine possibility that they had encountered something they could neither contain, nor control, nor eliminate. Something that existed outside their framework, not as violation, but as simple fact. And that fact was forcing them to make a choice they'd never had to make before: adapt to something they didn't understand, or continue fighting it until one of them broke. In the Watchtower, the Justice League assembled in emergency session. Batman presented the data he'd collected: the containment field collapse, the energy spikes, the signatures that suggested something in the bleed had just successfully resisted the Monitor's authority. Superman spoke first. "The Monitors tried to contain something and failed. That's concerning, but not necessarily a crisis. Maybe whatever they tried to contain isn't hostile." "The Monitors don't attempt containment without cause," Batman said. "If they moved against something, they believed it represented a threat." "The Monitors also destroyed multiple Earths during crisis events," Wonder Woman pointed out. "Their judgment isn't infallible." "Agreed," Batman said. "But their capability is significant. If they can't contain something, we need to know what that something is before it becomes our problem." "Do we have any way to observe what's happening?" Flash asked. "No. The bleed is outside our jurisdiction and our reach. Whatever's happening up there is happening beyond our ability to influence or even properly monitor." "So we wait," Green Lantern said. and hope the monitors can handle their own problems. Hoping hasn't traditionally been an effective strategy, Batman observed. Before anyone could respond, Cyborg's instruments registered a new alert. We've got anomalous energy readings, massive scale. Source is... I can't get a proper fix on source, but it's affecting background cosmic radiation across multiple sectors. Affecting how? Superman asked. It's getting cleaner. Crisis energy signatures are declining across the board. Whatever's happening in the bleed, it's having downstream effects on normal space. The League members looked at each other. Energy getting cleaner threats, declining the universe, becoming more stable, that all sounded positive. But the speed and scale of the change suggested forces at work that dwarfed anything they could properly comprehend. Keep monitoring, Batman said, and prepare contingency protocols. If whatever's happening up there spills down to our level, I want to be ready. Ready for what? Flash asked. Unknown, Batman admitted. Which is why we prepare for everything. In imaginary space, Rimuru watched as CL secured additional crisis energy reserves from the 6th dimension. Not as aggression, not as theft. Simply as precaution, ensuring that if the monitors attempted another assault, he would have the resources to defend without risking the beings under his protection. They're going to interpret this as escalation, he observed. Correct, CL agreed. But our priority is security, not their interpretation. If they continue attempting to breach imaginary space, we need the capacity to respond without limitations. And if they see that capacity build up as reason to deploy something more dangerous, then we'll deal with it when it happens. We've already demonstrated restraint. If they refuse to recognize that restraint, the failure is theirs, not ours. Rimuru settled into observation mode, watching the strange new reality around him with the patience of something that had learned to survive by understanding threats before they manifested. The monitors were afraid. That much was clear. And fear made any entities dangerous in unpredictable ways. But he had been afraid too once. Back when he was Satoru Mikami, before the reincarnation, before the power, when fear was just part of human existence. He remembered what it felt like to be uncertain, to face the unknown, and not know whether to fight or flee. The difference was that he'd grown beyond fear, and these monitors hadn't. That gap in evolution would determine everything that happened next. The multiverse continued its existence quieter, now cleaner, but increasingly tense. As two incompatible frameworks occupied the same reality and struggled to coexist without understanding. 3 cycles had passed since the anomaly arrived. The crisis was just beginning. The first sign that something fundamental had changed came not from the monitors, not from cosmic observation platforms, but from Central City at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon. Barry Allen was responding to a warehouse fire on the industrial district's east side. Standard flash protocol evacuate civilians, contain the blaze, prevent structural collapse. He'd done it 1,000 times. Muscle memory operating at speeds that made thought and action indistinguishable. He phased through the outer wall, intending to reach the trapped workers on the 2nd floor before the support beams gave way. The phase should have taken 0.003 seconds. Instead, it took 0.012 seconds, 4 times longer than it should have. Barry stumbled as he rematerialized the discrepancy, throwing off his momentum. He'd compensated for the delay instinctively, but the fact that there was a delay at all sent alarm bells through his nervous system. The Speed Force didn't have delays. It was absolute, immediate, responsive to his will at quantum scales. He tried again, phasing through a support column. 0.015 seconds, slower than the first attempt. "Wally," he said into his comm. Are you experiencing any unusual resistance from the Speed Force? Wally West's voice came back from Keystone City. Now that you mention it, yeah. I've been feeling like I'm running through syrup for the last 10 minutes. Thought I was just tired. You're not tired. Something's wrong with the connection. Barry pulled himself into the Speed Force properly, the way he did when he needed to move between microseconds. The transition should have been instantaneous. Instead, it felt like pushing through a membrane, like the Speed Force itself had developed friction where none had existed before. He managed the rescue, got the workers out, contained the fire. But every action took measurably longer than it should have. Not enough to cause failure, but enough to be noticeable. Enough to be wrong. By the time he returned to S-Tar, labs reports were coming in from every speedster on the planet. Impulse in Manchester, Jesse Quick in Los Angeles, Max Mercury in Arizona. All of them reporting the same thing: the Speed Force was still there, still accessible. But it was responding with a lag that shouldn't exist. Barry ran diagnostics with equipment designed to measure temporal phenomena. The results were consistent and disturbing. The Speed Force's normal state was absolute priority when a speedster accessed it. Reality restructured itself to accommodate that access. Physics bent. Causality adjusted. The universe made room for speed. Now the Speed Force was being treated as one option among many. Not disabled, not broken, just no longer absolute in its authority over local physics. It was being deprioritized. In Gotham, Batman received Barry's report at the same time Oracle flagged anomalies in the city's magical infrastructure. The detection wards that Dr. Fate had established around Arkham Asylum were responding 3.4 seconds slower than normal. The difference was small enough that the asylum's mundane security hadn't noticed, but Oracle's systems tracked everything to millisecond precision. 3.4 seconds. In a city where magical containment was the only thing preventing certain inmates from warping reality, 3.4 seconds was an eternity. Batman opened a priority channel to the Watchtower. Something's affecting fundamental forces. Speed Force is experiencing lag. Magic is responding slower than baseline. I need confirmation on other systems. Cyborg's voice came back within seconds. Running analysis now. Give me a minute. While he waited, Batman pulled up the cosmic monitoring data. The energy signatures in the bleed had changed again. The anomaly, whatever the monitors had tried and failed to contain, was no longer just absorbing crisis energy. It was interfacing with the deeper architecture of reality in ways the instruments could barely register. Cyborg came back on the line. You're right. I'm seeing degradation across multiple systems. Speed Force efficiency down by approximately 4%. Emotional spectrum response time increased by 2.8 seconds average. Magic is the worst 5.1 second delay on invocation to manifestation. Cause? Batman asked. Unknown. But the degradation started at the exact moment the monitor's containment field failed. Whatever they tried to cage is doing something to baseline reality. Batman thought about the timeline. 3 cycles since the anomaly arrived according to his calculations. 2 since the monitors attempted containment. And now, fundamental forces that had operated with absolute authority for millennia were experiencing friction. Convene the League, he said. Emergency session. Anyone with access to cosmic or magical systems needs to be briefed. Already on it, Cyborg confirmed. On Oa, the Guardians of the Universe convened an emergency council for the first time in 6 Earth months. The Green Lantern Corps' central power battery, the source of willpower-based reality manipulation for thousands of ring-bearers across the universe, was operating at 96% efficiency. For a system designed to be absolute, 4% degradation was catastrophic. The rings are compensating, Guardian Ganthet reported. Individual lanterns may not notice the difference in routine operations, but for sustained constructs or complex manipulations, the lag will become problematic. What's causing it? Guardian Sade asked. Unknown. But the degradation coincides with disturbances in the bleed. The monitor's attempted containment of an anomalous presence. The containment failed. Since that failure, every fundamental force in this reality has experienced measurable efficiency loss. The anomaly is attacking our systems, another Guardian asked. No evidence of attack, Ganthet said. The degradation appears to be passive effect rather than active assault, as if the anomaly's mere presence is causing reality's fundamental forces to compete for priority where before they operated with absolute authority. Sade leaned forward. Compete with what? With whatever framework the anomaly operates under. Our systems are being treated as local rather than universal. Suggestions rather than laws. The implications settled over the council. The emotional spectrum, the fundamental force that powered the Lantern Corps across all 7 colors, was being deprioritized by something that didn't recognize its authority. Not destroyed, not corrupted, just rendered non-absolute. We need to understand what we're dealing with, Sade said, before the degradation progresses further. In the Rock of Eternity, Shazam felt the change the moment it began. The living lightning that connected him to the gods, that channeled their power through his mortal form, suddenly felt distant. Not gone, not weakened. Just further away, as if the connection had to travel through additional layers of reality to reach him. He transformed back to Billy Batson and then to Shazam again, testing the invocation. The transformation completed, but it took 2 full seconds instead of the instantaneous shift he was accustomed to. 2 seconds during which he was vulnerable, powerless mortal. Wizard, he called out to the empty throne room. Are you seeing this? The ghost of the ancient wizard materialized, his translucent form flickering with unusual instability. The 7 deadly sins are restless. They sense the disruption in magical flows. This is not a localized phenomenon, Billy. Something has changed in the fundamental structure of how magic interfaces with reality. Changed how? Magic requires reality to acknowledge its authority. For millennia, that acknowledgement has been immediate and absolute. Now there is delay, hesitation, as if reality is checking with some other source before permitting magical manipulation. Billy transformed again, timing it carefully. 2.3 seconds, slower than before. Is it getting worse? Yes, and it will continue to worsen unless the source is identified and addressed. On Themyscira, Wonder Woman stood in the Temple of Athena, attempting a communion that should have been as natural as breathing. The connection to the Olympian gods had always been instantaneous. Her patron deities responded to prayer with the immediacy of family answering a call. Now there was lag. Not silence, not refusal. Just delay, as if her prayers had to travel through interference before reaching their destination. Athena's voice finally came through clearer than the others, but still distant. Diana, we feel it too. The connection between divine and mortal realms is experiencing disruption. Something in the cosmic architecture has changed. The monitors attempted to contain an anomaly in the bleed, Diana said. Could that be related? More than related. The anomaly is altering the priority structure of how reality processes fundamental forces. Divine power, magical invocation, speed, force, access, all of these operate on the principle of absolute authority. Now that authority is being questioned by something that doesn't recognize it. Is this an attack? No. An attack implies intent to harm. This is more like incompatibility. Two different frameworks of reality occupying the same space with neither fully yielding to the other. Wonder Woman considered that. Can the gods intervene? We are attempting to understand the phenomenon before acting. Zeus is furious naturally. He views this as challenge to divine authority. But Athena counsels patience until we know what we're dealing with. And if the degradation continues. Athena was quiet for a moment. Then we may need to accept that the universe no longer operates solely on our terms. At the Hall of Justice, the emergency session convened with unprecedented attendance. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Cyborg, Aquaman, Shazam, Martian Manhunter. Even Zatanna had teleported in from a tour in Europe, her face drawn with concern. Magic is failing, she said without preamble. Not broken, not corrupted, just slower. Spells that should manifest instantly are taking seconds. Complex workings are becoming unpredictable because the lag varies by invocation. Same with the Speed Force, Flash confirmed. I can still access it, but there's resistance. Like reality is making me ask permission instead of just letting me go. The emotional spectrum is experiencing similar degradation, Green Lantern added. OA confirms it's affecting all 7 cores. Will fear, hope, rage, all of them are responding with measurable delay. Superman looked around the table. So every fundamental force that makes us effective is being compromised simultaneously. That's not coincidence. No, Batman agreed. That's systematic. Something is reducing the priority of DC's reality warping systems, not destroying them, just making them non-absolute. The anomaly in the bleed, Wonder Woman said. The one the monitors tried to contain. This started after their containment failed. Causation or correlation? Superman asked. Given the timeline, almost certainly causation, Batman said. Whatever the monitors tried to cage responded by altering how our fundamental forces interact with baseline reality. Martian Manhunter, who had been silent until now, spoke with unusual gravity. I have been attempting to telepathically scan the area of the bleed where the anomaly resides. The psychic interference is absolute. Not hostile, not defensive, just impenetrable, as if that space operates under completely different rules about what consciousness even is. So we have an entity that can neutralize monitor containment, degrade fundamental forces across the entire DC universe, and block telepathic scan, Cyborg summarized. And we have no idea what it wants or what it is. We know one thing, Batman said. It's not trying to destroy these systems. If it wanted them gone, they'd be gone. Instead, it's reducing their priority, making them optional rather than absolute. Why would something do that? Flash asked. Defense, Wonder Woman said. If our systems operated with absolute authority, they could potentially override the anomaly's own framework. By deprioritizing them, it's ensuring its own existence can't be negated by speed force physics or magical reality manipulation. That's a very sophisticated form of self-preservation, Superman observed. Whatever this is, it's not mindless. The monitors know more than they're telling us, Batman said. They attempted containment for a reason, and that containment failed for a reason. We need information from the source. The monitors don't typically respond to requests from planetary governments, Aquaman pointed out. Then we go through channels that have cosmic authority, Wonder Woman said. The gods are monitoring the situation. They can petition the monitors directly. Before anyone could respond, every alarm in the Hall of Justice activated simultaneously. Cyborg's instruments lit up with alerts that made his expression shift from concern to something approaching fear. "We've got a situation," he said. "Multiple situations. Magical containment failures at 3 locations. Speed force anomalies in 4 cities. And something's happening in the ocean that Aquaman needs to hear about right now." Aquaman's communication implant activated Atlantean voices speaking in rapid underwater clicks. His expression darkened. The magical barriers protecting Atlantis from deep-sea pressure are experiencing failures. Not total collapse, but the spells are cycling on and off. We have minutes, maybe hours, before sections of the city start flooding. "Arkham Asylum's wards are failing," Batman added, checking his own alerts. "The magical containment on Poison Ivy Clayface and Mad Hatter is fluctuating. If it drops below threshold, we'll have 3 reality-warping inmates loose in Gotham." "Central City's temporal stabilizers are offline," Flash reported. "We use Speed Force energy to prevent time anomalies in the downtown sector. Without it, we're looking at potential temporal fractures." The League looked at each other with dawning understanding. The degradation wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a structural failure cascade. Every system they'd built that relied on absolute authority from fundamental forces was now experiencing critical instability. Superman stood. "We split up, addressed the immediate crises, but someone needs to make contact with whatever's in the bleed before this gets worse." "I'll handle it," Wonder Woman said. "The gods can open channels to the Monitor realm. If anyone can establish communication, it's through divine intermediaries." "Do it fast," Batman said. "Because if this degradation continues at current rate, we're looking at complete infrastructure failure within 72 hours. The League dispersed to handle emergency response, leaving Batman alone with the cosmic monitoring equipment. He pulled up the data on the anomaly, studying the patterns of energy flow, the way crisis energy was being systematically drained and sequestered. Whatever was in the bleed wasn't attacking them. It was just existing in a way that made their reality's fundamental rules optional rather than mandatory. And that difference between being attacked and simply being deprioritized was forcing Batman to reconsider everything he thought he understood about cosmic hierarchy. In the bleed, the monitors watched the cascading effects with growing alarm. The degradation was spreading faster than their models predicted, affecting systems they hadn't anticipated would be vulnerable. "This is unacceptable." Tharakul said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "The entity is dismantling the fundamental architecture of our reality." "It's not dismantling," Zillow Vaya corrected, studying the data with clinical precision. "It's deprioritizing. Every system is still functional. They're just no longer absolute." "The difference is semantic," Tharakul snapped. "Speed Force, emotional spectrum, magical frameworks. All of them are experiencing degradation. How long before the degradation becomes failure?" "Unknown," Roxtal said. "But the rate is accelerating. Initial degradation was 4%. Current readings show 6.2% and climbing." Dax Novu looked at Zillow Vala. "You predicted this. You warned that escalation would trigger defensive responses." "I warned that aggression would be met with countermeasures," Zillow Vala said. "But I didn't predict this. This isn't counterattack. This is the anomaly establishing its own priority in our reality's hierarchy. It's making room for itself by reducing the absolute authority of our systems." "Why would it need to do that?" Novurel asked. "Because our systems operating at full absolute authority could theoretically override the anomaly's existence," Zilovaya explained. "Speed Force could negate its temporal coherence. Magic could rewrite its dimensional structure. The emotional spectrum could impose emotional states that alter its fundamental nature. By deprioritizing these systems, the anomaly ensures its own framework cannot be overridden. That's an act of war, Tharakul said. That's an act of survival, Zilovaya countered. We tried to cage it. It responded by making itself uncageable. The fault line here isn't the anomaly's defense. It's our aggression. Before the debate could continue, alarms sounded across Platform Sigma-7. Something was happening in the dark multiverse, that nightmare realm where failed realities festered and mutated into existential threats. Rox Tal brought up the readings. The dark multiverse is experiencing containment degradation. The barriers that prevent dark worlds from manifesting in our reality are losing coherence. Is the anomaly attacking the dark multiverse? Dax Novu asked. No, Rox Tal said slowly. It's the opposite. The dark multiverse uses reality warping principles similar to magic and the Speed Force. As those systems degrade in our reality, the dark multiverse's ability to breach containment is also degrading. It's being deprioritized just like everything else. Zilovala understood immediately. The anomaly isn't targeting specific systems. It's reducing the priority of any framework that operates through reality manipulation. Ours, theirs doesn't matter. If it functions by overriding base physics, it's being downgraded to suggestion rather than law. Then this isn't an attack on DC specifically, Novurel said. It's the anomaly establishing its own existence as the new baseline, and everything else has to compete for priority. The implications were staggering. The anomaly hadn't declared war on the DC multiverse. It had simply refused to be subject to the multiverse's rules. And in doing so, it had changed what those rules meant for everything else. Inside Imaginary Space CL monitored the cascading effects with the detached precision of an entity that processed cause and effect without emotional investment. The local systems are adapting poorly to deprioritization, she informed Rimuru. Infrastructure built on assumptions of absolute authority is experiencing critical failures. Are we causing those failures? Rimuru asked. Indirectly. We're not attacking their systems. We're simply existing under our own framework, which forces their frameworks to compete for priority rather than operate with guaranteed precedence. The failures are occurring because their civilization built everything on the assumption that certain forces would always be absolute. That's a design flaw on their part. Agreed. But the practical result is that we're being blamed for consequences they failed to anticipate. Rimuru thought about Tempest, about the careful engineering required to build a nation that could survive even if he wasn't there to maintain it personally. Redundancy, backup systems, infrastructure that didn't rely on absolute authority from any single force. The DC universe apparently had never needed to learn that lesson. Can we mitigate the failures without compromising our own security? He asked. Partially. We could restore some degree of priority to their systems in non-critical areas. But doing so would require active management of reality priority protocols. We would essentially be deciding which of their systems get to function at what efficiency level, which makes us the arbiter of their reality's operation. Yes. Rimuru was quiet for a moment. That's not a role I want. The alternative is allowing the cascading failures to continue until their infrastructure adapts or collapses. How long until adaptation? Unknown. Their civilization has operated under absolute priority systems for millennia. Adaptation may take decades or longer. And collapse. At current degradation rates, critical infrastructure failure in 70 to 90 hours. Rimuru made a decision. Stabilize the systems at current degradation levels. Don't restore them to absolute authority, but prevent further decline. Make it clear we're not trying to destroy their reality, just ensuring they can't override ours. Understood. Implementing stabilization protocols. The degradation stopped accelerating. Across the DC universe, fundamental forces stabilized at approximately 94% efficiency. Still degraded, still non-absolute, but no longer declining. The League noticed immediately. Flash, responding to a temporal fracture in Central City, felt the speed force resistance stop increasing. It didn't get better, but it stopped getting worse. The degradations plateaued, he reported to the watchtower. Still there, but stable. Similar reports came in from Atlantis, from Arkham Asylum, from magical practitioners across the globe. The systems were compromised, but functional. Degraded, but stable. Batman studied the timeline. The degradation had accelerated steadily until exactly 3 minutes ago. Then, it stopped. Not randomly, not coincidentally. Whatever was in the bleed had made a choice. It could have continued the degradation to total collapse. Instead, it had stabilized the systems at a level that ensured its own security, while preventing catastrophic failure. It was showing restraint. Or more accurately, it was demonstrating that it could destroy, but was choosing not to. The message was clear: DC's systems would continue to function, but they would never again be absolute. And the anomaly, whatever it was, had established itself as an equal priority to forces that had been supreme for eons. The universe ached, but it endured. And in that endurance, a new hierarchy was being written. One where absolute authority was a memory and coexistence was no longer optional. The decision to deploy crisis-based containment came from desperation rather than strategy. The monitors had watched their conventional systems fail, had seen the anomaly deprioritize fundamental forces with casual efficiency, and had run out of options that didn't involve the one resource they'd spent millennia trying to control. Crisis energy. Thara Kool stood before the Emergency Council with a proposal that made even the most aggressive monitors hesitate. We've been approaching this wrong. Our containment protocols operate on conventional dimensional physics. The anomaly has proven those physics are optional within its framework, but crisis energy doesn't follow physics. It follows narrative causality. You want to use crisis energy as a weapon? Zillow Vaya said, her voice flat with disbelief. The same energy that's caused every extinction-level event in our history. That's your solution. Not as a weapon, Thara Kool corrected. As a definition tool. Crisis energy doesn't just destroy or transform, it establishes what is and isn't possible within a given context. If we deploy it correctly, we can use it to define the anomaly's parameters. Force it into a shape we can understand and manage. Dax Novu studied the proposal with growing unease. You're suggesting we use the fundamental force of catastrophic change to impose structure on something that's already proven. It exists outside structure. The risk of unintended consequences is incalculable. The risk of doing nothing is guaranteed failure, Thara Kool countered. The anomaly has stabilized the degradation, yes. But at 94% efficiency, our reality is permanently compromised as long as it maintains this presence. We need to either eliminate it or force it into compliance with our frameworks. And if the crisis energy doesn't work? Novurel asked. If the anomaly proves immune to narrative causality the way it's proven immune to conventional physics, Then at least we'll know, Tharakul said. Right now, we're operating blind. Every assumption we make about its capabilities proves inadequate. Crisis energy is the only force we possess that operates on principles alien enough to potentially affect something this fundamentally other. Rox Tal pulled up simulations of what crisis-based containment would look like. The models were ugly, vast expenditures of energy that had historically resulted in universal restructuring, timeline collapse, or reality-wide extinction events. But the simulations also showed theoretical pathways to success. If the crisis energy could establish narrative parameters around the anomaly, if it could force the entity into a defined role within DC's cosmology, then containment became possible. The vote was closer than previous decisions. 5-5 with Zillow Vala and 4 others opposing. Monitor Primus, who rarely intervened in operational decisions, cast the deciding vote. Proceed with crisis-based containment, he said. But establish fail-safe protocols. If the deployment shows signs of cascade beyond projected parameters, abort immediately. Zillow Vala turned to Primus. You're authorizing the use of extinction-level energy against something we don't understand. If this backfires, the consequences won't be limited to the anomaly. If we do nothing, Primus replied, we accept permanent degradation of our reality's fundamental systems. That is also unacceptable. We choose the option with potential for restoration over guaranteed compromise. The preparations took one full cycle. Crisis energy couldn't be deployed casually. It required containment structures, directional focusing, and narrative framing that would guide the energy toward definition rather than destruction. The monitors worked with precision, born from millennia of crisis management, building a deployment framework that theoretically would impose structure on the anomaly without triggering universal catastrophe. Theoretically. Batman detected the energy buildup 6 hours before deployment. His instruments weren't sophisticated enough to identify crisis energy specifically, but they registered the bleed distortions that came with its accumulation. Massive concentrations of reality warping potential focused on the coordinates where the anomaly resided. He opened an emergency channel to the watchtower. The monitors are preparing something big. Energy signatures suggest they're deploying forces beyond anything they've used previously. Can you determine intent? Wonder Woman asked. No, but given the scale, they're either trying to destroy the anomaly or contain it with overwhelming force. Either way, we need to prepare for spillover effects. Spillover? Flash asked. If they're using the kind of energy I think they're using, and if it doesn't work the way they expect, we could be looking at reality fractures extending down to planetary level. Superman's voice cut in. Can we intervene? Not at that scale, Batman admitted. Whatever happens in the bleed stays in the bleed. We can only prepare for consequences. In the watchtower, the League mobilized for disaster response. They had no ability to influence what was about to happen, but they could position assets to handle whatever emerged from it. Emergency protocols went active across every major city. Atlantis prepared for potential dimensional breaches. Themyscira readied defensive wards. The Green Lantern Corps established observation posts at the edge of the solar system. And they waited. Inside imaginary space, CL registered the crisis energy accumulation with interest rather than alarm. She'd analyzed every major energy type in the DC universe during the synchronization process. Crisis energy was unique. It operated on principles that bordered on narrative rather than physical causality. It was the universe's reset button, the force that allowed impossible things to become real through the sheer weight of catastrophic change. They're deploying crisis energy, she informed Rimuru. Large-scale concentration. Target appears to be our position. Purpose, Rimuru asked. Analysis suggests attempted reality definition. They're not trying to destroy us directly. They're trying to use crisis energy to impose structure to define what we are within their cosmological framework. Rimuru considered that. He understood the logic. If something existed outside your framework, you either eliminated it or forced it inside. The monitors had failed at elimination. Now, they were attempting forced integration. Will it work? He asked. No, CL said with absolute certainty. Crisis energy operates on narrative causality within the DC framework. We exist outside that framework. The energy cannot define what it cannot properly perceive. But the attempt will be interesting. Interesting how crisis energy is transformative by nature. When it encounters something it cannot transform, the energy itself must adapt or dissipate. Given the quantity they're deploying, dissipation is unlikely. Adaptation is almost certain. Rimuru understood the implication immediately. They're giving us crisis energy to work with. Essentially, yes. The energy cannot impose structure on us, but we can analyze and process it. And given our capability with turn null, we can likely convert crisis energy into usable resources. They're trying to cage us with the one thing that might actually make us stronger in this reality. Correct. The irony is pronounced. Rimuru settled deeper into observation mode. He could stop the deployment before it started. A demonstration of Beelzebub's range would disable the focusing arrays before they activated. But that would be aggressive preemptive. It would confirm every fear the monitors had about his intentions. Better to let them try. Let them see what happened when they deployed their ultimate weapon against something that processed catastrophic energy as nutrition rather than threat. Prepare Azathoth for crisis energy absorption, he instructed. Full analysis protocol. I want to understand this energy type completely. Acknowledged. Azathoth standing by for intake processing. The deployment began at what the monitors designated as the optimal narrative moment, a point in time when the DC universe's causality was maximally receptive to transformative events. The crisis. Energy released from containment flowed through the focusing arrays and converged on the anomaly's position with precision that would have made the anti-monitor himself envious. The energy was designed to impose definition, to take something formless or other and give it shape, purpose, role within the grand narrative of DC's cosmology. It was the force that turned abstract threats into concrete villains, that transformed nebulous concepts into entities that could be fought and defeated. It struck imaginary space with the weight of a collapsing universe. For exactly 3 seconds, the energy attempted to fulfill its purpose. It probed the boundary, searching for hooks, narrative elements. It could amplify weaknesses, it could define structures, it could reshape. The sensors on Platform Sigma-7 registered massive expenditure as the crisis energy worked to impose form on something that refused to have form imposed. Then something changed. The energy stopped trying to transform. Instead, it started flowing inward, not dissipating, not reflecting, simply entering imaginary space in a steady stream that suggested intake rather than assault. Energy deployment successful, Roxtal reported, watching the telemetry. Crisis energy is making contact with the anomaly's boundary, attempting structural imposition now. But even as she spoke, the readings began showing discrepancies. The energy signature was changing. The crisis energy, that fundamental force of catastrophic transformation, was being processed, analyzed, deconstructed into component principles, and absorbed into systems the instruments couldn't properly track. Something's wrong, Novurel said, her crisis prediction algorithms and screaming warnings. The energy isn't imposing structure. It's being consumed. Tharakul stared at the displays in growing disbelief. That's not possible. Crisis energy doesn't get consumed. It transforms or it dissipates. Those are the only options. Tell that to the anomaly, Zilovaya said quietly, because it appears to be eating your ultimate weapon. Inside imaginary space, Azathoth processed the incoming crisis energy with the methodical efficiency of a system designed to handle void energy, the primordial force of uncreation from the Tensura universe. Crisis energy was different in flavor, more narrative-focused, but fundamentally, it was still energy designed to unmake and remake. And Azathoth specialized in consuming exactly that kind of force. The crisis energy flowed in, was analyzed for underlying structure, stripped down to base components, and converted into turn null, the fundamental nothingness from which Rimuru could create or destroy at conceptual levels. The conversion wasn't perfect. Some of the narrative causality elements resisted processing. But the raw transformative potential translated efficiently. Absorption rate exceeding projections, CL reported. Crisis energy composition is more compatible with turn null conversion than anticipated. Current reserves increasing at geometric rate. Rimuru monitored the intake with the calm of someone who'd accidentally discovered that his enemy's poison was actually high-grade nutritional supplement. How much are they deploying? Estimate suggests enough crisis energy to restructure a medium-sized universe. They appear to be using stockpiles accumulated from multiple crisis events. And we're converting all of it, approximately 87%. The remainder contains narrative elements too tightly bound to DC's framework for clean extraction. Those portions are being sequestered for later analysis. On platform Sigma 7, alarms began sounding across every monitoring station. The crisis energy deployment wasn't failing. It was succeeding in exactly the wrong way. Instead of imposing structure on the anomaly, it was feeding it. The entity was processing extinction-level forces as casually as a terrestrial organism might process sunlight. Abort deployment, Tharakul ordered. Shut down the focusing arrays immediately. Unable to comply, Roxtal said, her voice tight with strain. The arrays are operating as designed. The energy flow is one way by necessity. We can't reverse the deployment without causing cascade failure in the containment structures. Then trigger the fail-safe protocols. The fail-safes are designed to prevent cascade within our reality. They don't apply to whatever's happening inside the anomaly space. We committed to full deployment. We have to let it complete. Tharakul watched helplessly as the crisis energy reserves stockpiled carefully over countless cycles meant to be used only in the most desperate circumstances flowed into the anomaly at an accelerating rate. The entity wasn't just absorbing the energy. It was converting it into something else entirely. Something the instruments registered as void adjacent, but fundamentally distinct from anything in the DC cosmological database. Zilovaya studied the conversion process with the detached fascination of someone watching a catastrophic mistake unfold in real time. It's turning crisis energy into turn null. That's what the readings are showing. It's taking the fundamental force of catastrophic change and converting it into primordial void energy. How is that possible? Dax Novu asked. Because the anomaly doesn't operate on our principles, Zilovaya explained. Crisis energy works by transforming things within DC's framework. But the anomaly exists outside that framework. So when crisis energy tries to transform it, the energy itself gets transformed instead. It's being processed as raw material, rather than as a weapon. The deployment completed after 17 minutes. The crisis energy reserves were depleted, not destroyed, but converted into something the monitors could no longer access or utilize. The anomaly's boundary hadn't changed visibly, but the readings showed massive energy accumulation within imaginary space. Power reserves that now exceeded anything short of the fundamental forces themselves. The silence on platform Sigma 7 was absolute. Tharakul stared at the displays, his certainty finally cracking. We just armed it. We deployed our most powerful resource, and we armed it. Yes, Zilovaya said simply. You did? How much turn null did it accumulate? Novurel asked, her voice hollow. Unknown, Roxtal said. But estimates suggest enough to unmake and remake significant portions of our reality if deployed offensively. We've just given the anomaly the resources to potentially end the multiverse. Not end, Zilovaya corrected. The anomaly could have ended us already if that was its goal. But we've given it the capacity to defend itself against anything we could theoretically deploy in the future. We've ensured that no force in our cosmology could threaten it, even if we wanted to try. The implications settled over the council like a shroud. They'd escalated from observation to containment to crisis deployment. Each step had failed more spectacularly than the last. And now they'd armed the anomaly with enough power to potentially challenge the fundamental forces of DC's reality itself. Primus spoke for the first time since authorizing the deployment. We have failed comprehensively. Every action we've taken has strengthened the anomaly's position while weakening our own. The question now is whether we continue this pattern or accept a truth we've been avoiding. What truth? Tharakul asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. That we cannot control this entity. We cannot contain it. We cannot define it within our frameworks. And every attempt to do so has made our situation worse. We must decide, do we accept coexistence with something we cannot manage, or do we escalate until one of us ceases to exist? The chamber fell silent. The monitors who had managed the multiverse for eons, who had survived multiple crisis events, who had restructured reality itself when necessary, faced a decision they'd never had to make before. Surrender or annihilation. Those were the only options remaining. In the watchtower, the League monitored the aftermath of the energy deployment. The readings were catastrophic from a conventional perspective. Enough power had been released to theoretically restructure solar systems. But there were no explosions, no reality fractures, no spillover effects. Just silence. And then a subtle change in the background energy readings across every monitoring station. The anomaly's power signature just increased by orders of magnitude, Cyborg reported. Whatever the monitors deployed, it didn't destroy the entity. It made it stronger. How much stronger? Superman asked. Cyborg ran the calculations 3 times before answering. Strong enough that if it decided to act offensively, I'm not sure anything in our reality could stop it. Batman absorbed that information with the cold assessment that made him effective in situations where optimism was liability. But it hasn't acted offensively. Despite being attacked contained, and now apparently empowered, it's remained defensive. That's the only reason we're still here, Wonder Woman said quietly. Whatever this entity is, it could have destroyed us. It still could. But it's choosing not to. Then we need to change our approach, Superman said. We've been preparing for disaster. Maybe we should be preparing for diplomacy. Diplomacy requires communication, Flash pointed out. How do we talk to something that exists outside our framework? We find someone who can bridge frameworks, Wonder Woman said. The gods have been monitoring this situation. They might have insights we lack. Before anyone could respond, Martian Manhunter's telepathic voice resonated in everyone's mind simultaneously. Something is happening. The psychic background of the entire solar system just changed. It's not hostile, but it's present. More present than before. The anomaly, Batman asked. Yes and no. The anomaly hasn't moved, hasn't expanded, but its influence is now detectable at ranges that were previously silent, as if it was invisible before and has just decided to become visible. In the bleed, the monitors registered the same phenomenon. The anomaly, which had maintained strict separation between its space and DC's reality, was now projecting a detectable signature. Not aggressively, not expansively, just present. It was making itself known, not as a threat, as a fact. Zillow Vala understood first. It's done being passive. We kept attacking it, kept trying to cage it, kept refusing to accept its existence as legitimate. So now it's making acceptance non-optional. It's declaring that it exists, that it will continue to exist, and that our frameworks will have to accommodate that existence whether we like it or not. That's a declaration of war, Tharakul said, but his voice lacked conviction. That's a declaration of sovereignty, Zilovaya corrected. And we drove it to that declaration through our own aggression. Inside imaginary space, Rimuru reviewed the turn null reserves with satisfaction. The crisis energy conversion had been unexpectedly efficient. He now possessed enough resources to defend against virtually any threat this reality could generate. Not that he intended to use those resources offensively. He'd learned long ago that power was most effective when it never needed to be demonstrated. But having the power changed negotiation dynamics considerably. Synchronization complete, CL reported. We are now fully adapted to this reality's base physics. Imaginary space is stable and permanent. External interference is no longer possible without our explicit permission. And the locals? Aware of our presence, alarmed, but no longer attempting active aggression. The crisis energy deployment appears to have exhausted their offensive options. Rimuru thought about the monitors, about their fear and their desperation. He'd been in similar positions before, back when Tempest was new and surrounded by nations that didn't understand what he was building. Some of those nations had become allies once they understood he wasn't a threat. Others had required more forceful boundary enforcement. The question was, which category would the monitors fall into? Open a communication channel, he decided. Not to the monitors directly. Too confrontational. Find whatever passes for neutral diplomatic intermediaries in this reality. Let them know we're willing to establish terms for coexistence. Understood. Searching for appropriate intermediaries now. The DC universe continued its existence quieter than before, fundamentally changed in ways most of its inhabitants didn't yet comprehend. The crisis energy was gone, converted into something alien and other. The fundamental forces remained degraded but stable. And in the space between realities, an entity that should not exist had just declared that existence was no longer up for negotiation. The monitors faced a choice: accept the new hierarchy or fight until nothing remained. And for the first time in their long existence, they genuinely didn't know which option represented wisdom and which represented annihilation. The crisis had just begun. But the war might already be over. The dark multiverse had been screaming for 3 hours. Not literally, it lacked the consciousness for vocalization. but across every monitoring station attuned to that nightmare realm, where failed realities festered and mutated, the readings showed distress patterns that would have been screams if translated into sound. The barriers that separated doomed Earths from manifesting in prime reality were losing coherence not through breach, but through deprioritization. The dark multiverse operated on despair and corruption, warping the laws of physics through sheer narrative weight of failure. It was a reality manipulation system as fundamental as the speed force or emotional spectrum. And like those systems, it was being downgraded from absolute to optional. Barbatos, who had once nearly consumed the entire multiverse during the Dark Knight's metal event, registered the change from his imprisonment in the World Forge. The darkness that had been his to command the nightmare energies that responded to his will with absolute obedience suddenly felt distant. Not gone. Just requiring permission from something that had never existed in his cosmology before. He couldn't manifest new dark worlds, couldn't corrupt stable realities into failed versions, couldn't even properly influence the nightmares already spawned from his essence. The anomaly in the bleed had established priority over his domain without conquest, without conflict, simply by existing under rules that didn't acknowledge his authority. For the first time since his creation, Barbatos experienced something approaching helplessness. The monitors detected the dark multiverse's distress within minutes of the crisis energy deployment's completion. Rox Tal brought up the readings with hands that trembled slightly. A monitor showing physical stress response was rare enough to be alarming in itself. "The dark multiverse is experiencing critical stability loss," she reported. Not from external attack. The corruption vectors that allow nightmare realities to form are being treated as low-priority processes. New dark worlds aren't spawning. Existing ones are losing dimensional coherence. "Is the anomaly attacking the dark multiverse?" Dax Novu asked. "No," Zillow Vaya said, studying the data with grim recognition. "It's the same deprioritization affecting our systems. The dark multiverse operates through reality manipulation, corrupting physics, warping causality, imposing nightmare logic over natural law. The anomaly is downgrading those manipulations just like it downgraded ours." "Then it's protecting us," Thara Kul said, grasping for any interpretation that suggested the anomaly might be allied rather than adversarial. "It's protecting itself," Zilovaya corrected. "The dark multiverse could theoretically corrupt the anomaly's space the same way it corrupts stable realities. By deprioritizing those corruption vectors, it's ensuring immunity. That we benefit is incidental." Monitor Novu Rel pulled up cascade projections. If the dark multiverse continues losing stability, we're looking at potential dissolution of the entire nightmare realm within 72 hours. Every failed Earth, every dark world, every nightmare entity, all of it could collapse into non-existence. The chamber fell silent. The dark multiverse was a threat, certainly. It had nearly destroyed everything during the metal crisis. But it was also a fundamental part of the cosmic ecosystem, the shadow to the light, the failure state that made success meaningful. Its dissolution would restructure the multiverse in ways nobody could predict. "Do we intervene?" Dax Novu asked. "With what?" Zillow Vaya asked tiredly. "Our crisis energy is gone converted into the anomaly's resources. Our containment technology failed. Our fundamental forces are degraded. What intervention could we possibly mount?" Before anyone could answer, new alarms activated across Platform Sigma-7. This time, the source wasn't the dark multiverse. It was the antimatter universe, that mirror realm where the Anti-Monitor had once ruled with absolute authority over destructive forces. The antimatter remnants, those fragments of the Anti-Monitor's essence that had survived multiple defeats and reformations, were losing cohesion. The readings showed the same pattern, reality manipulation systems being downgraded. Absolute authority becoming conditional cosmic scale threats reduced to manageable problems through simple deprioritization. The anti-monitor remnants are degrading, Roxtal reported. They're not being destroyed. They're losing the ability to reform. The antimatter that responds to their will is treating their commands as suggestions rather than imperatives. How is that possible? Theracool demanded. Antimatter doesn't have will. It doesn't make choices about what commands to follow. It does now, Zilovala said. Or, rather, something with higher priority than the anti-monitor is making those choices. The anomaly exists at a level that supersedes even fundamental cosmic entities. When antimatter has to choose between the anti-monitor's will and the anomaly's implicit framework, it's choosing the anomaly. The cascade was accelerating. Within the next hour, reports came in from every cosmic monitoring station. Perpetua's echo, which had been growing stronger in the sixth dimension, suddenly fell silent, not destroyed, but rendered inert, unable to manifest through the dimensional barriers that had been weakening. The connection between the echo and the dark multiverse, which had been amplifying both, severed completely. Perpetua's influence, which had shaped the multiverse at its deepest levels, was being isolated from the systems that allowed it to act. In the Phantom Zone, entities that existed through reality warping imprisonment suddenly found their containment functioning differently. The zone had always operated on absolute principles beings entered and couldn't leave without external intervention. Now the absoluteness was conditional. Prisoners weren't escaping, but the certainty of their imprisonment had become probabilistic rather than guaranteed. Superman received an urgent message from the Fortress of Solitude's monitoring systems. The Phantom Zone is experiencing structural anomalies. Containment integrity remains functional, but the underlying physics have changed. I need to inspect this directly. He flew to the Arctic within minutes, entering the fortress to find the Phantom Zone projector displaying readings that made no sense. The zone still existed. The prisoners were still contained. But the mathematical certainty that had defined the prison for millennia was now operating on what the Kryptonian technology could only describe as conditional permission. Jor-El's notes never mentioned anything like this, Superman said to the empty fortress. The zone was supposed to be absolute. Kalex, the fortress's AI, processed the data with mechanical precision. The zone remains functional Kal-El, but it now operates under protocols not present in the original design. Something with higher authority than Kryptonian physics has imposed limitations on the zone's absolute nature. Higher authority than Kryptonian science. Superman stared at the readings. What could possibly have that kind of priority? On Apocalypse, Darkseid stood before his throne and felt something impossible. The Omega effect, that fundamental force of entropy and annihilation that had made him feared across galaxies, responded to his will with unprecedented resistance. Not refusal, not rebellion, just delay. As if his divine authority had to request permission from something that existed at a level beyond even new gods. He attempted to project the Omega beams, those weapons that could erase beings from existence across all timelines. The beams formed, but the process took seconds instead of instantaneous manifestation. The energy was there. The power remained. But the absolute certainty that the beams would annihilate their target had become probabilistic. Desad. Darkseid's voice carried the edge of fury that made entire planets surrender without conflict. Explain what has compromised the Omega effect. Desad approached with the careful terror of someone who knew Darkseid's patience had limits measured in microseconds. My lord, the cosmic infrastructure is experiencing unprecedented changes. Something in the bleed, an entity the monitors attempted to contain, has altered the priority hierarchy of reality manipulation systems. The Omega effect remains yours to command, but it no longer operates with guaranteed absoluteness. Nothing supersedes Darkseid, he stated with the flat certainty of someone who'd conquered galaxies through sheer will. Nothing in our cosmology, my lord. But this entity appears to exist outside our cosmology, while simultaneously occupying space within it. The paradox is causing cascading effects across all systems that operate through imposed will, rather than natural law. Darkseid turned his gaze toward the distant stars, toward the bleed that separated dimensions, toward the space, where something fundamentally other had established itself without his permission. He'd dealt with cosmic threats before, had allied with enemies. Betrayed allies reshaped entire civilizations in pursuit of the anti-life equation. But this was different. This wasn't a threat to conquer. This was a restructuring of how reality itself processed authority. And for the first time in ages, beyond counting Darkseid considered the possibility that there existed something he could not simply overpower. In the Watchtower, the Justice League assembled as reports flooded in from across the solar system. The cosmic ecosystem was collapsing in ways that defied conventional crisis response. Nothing was being destroyed. Nobody was being killed. But the fundamental certainty that had governed how power functioned in the DC universe was evaporating. "The Phantom Zone is compromised," Superman reported. "Not breached, but its absolute nature is gone. Prisoners remain contained, but the containment is now conditional." "Darkseid's forces on Earth are withdrawing," Wonder Woman added. "Intelligence from Themyscira suggests his Omega effect is experiencing functional degradation. He can still use it, but not with the certainty that made him willing to deploy it against major powers." "The dark multiverse is losing cohesion," Batman said, reading from reports Oracle had compiled. "Barbatos's ability to spawn nightmare realities has been neutralized. Not through imprisonment, through deprioritization." Green Lantern connected from Oa. "The Guardians are confirming that every cosmic-scale entity relying on reality manipulation is experiencing the same degradation. The anti-monitor remnants, Perpetua's echo, even Trigon's dimensional anchors are becoming non-absolute. Whatever this anomaly is, it's restructuring cosmic hierarchy without consultation." Cyborg pulled up a comprehensive map showing all reported anomalies. The pattern was clear. Anything that operated by imposing will on reality, whether through divine authority, cosmic power, or dimensional manipulation, was being downgraded. Natural laws remained unchanged. Physics continued to function. But the exceptions to those laws, the entities that had operated above natural law, were being forced to operate within it. "It's not an attack," Martian Manhunter observed. "It's more like ecosystem correction. As if the universe had too many apex predators and something reset the food chain. Except the thing doing the resetting is now the apex predator," Flash pointed out. "Everything else is getting pushed down the hierarchy." "Not everything," Batman corrected. "We're not experiencing degradation. Our powers function normally because they work with natural law rather than against it. Superman derives power from solar radiation, physics-based. Diana's strength comes from divine heritage, but manifests through physical capability. Even the Speed Force degraded, as it still operates through Barry's connection to natural temporal flow. So, entities that cooperate with reality are fine, Wonder Diana said. Entities that try to override reality are being limited, which means the anomaly is enforcing a specific kind of order, Superman said. Not chaos, not destruction, but a hierarchy where natural law has priority over imposed will. Before anyone could respond, Wonder Woman's communication crystal activated, projecting the image of Athena with unusual urgency. "Diana, we need to speak. The gods have reached consensus." "I'm in emergency session," Diana said. "Can this wait?" "No, the situation in the bleed affects all of us. The entity that the monitors attempted to contain has just neutralized Ares' ability to manifest war as inevitable force. Hades reports that souls are no longer bound to the underworld with absolute certainty. Apollo's prophecies are becoming suggestions rather than fate. The entire Olympian pantheon is experiencing what you would call demotion." The League members looked at each other with dawning comprehension. If even the gods were being deprioritized, then the scope of what was happening extended beyond cosmic infrastructure into the foundational mythology of their reality. "What do the gods recommend?" Diana asked. "Communication," Athena said simply. "We've been observing the anomaly since its arrival. It has demonstrated defensive capability, but not offensive aggression. It has shown restraint when it could have shown destruction. And it has just sent out a signal indicating willingness to establish diplomatic contact." "It's offering to talk?" Superman asked. "Not offering, informing." The signal was broadcast through channels that only entities operating at cosmic awareness can detect. The gods received it. The monitors received it. Anyone with sufficient perception to understand what's happening received the same message: coexistence is possible, but on terms that acknowledge the anomaly's sovereignty. Batman leaned forward. "What terms?" "Unknown." The signal contained the offer, but not the details. "Those require direct negotiation, which is why I'm contacting you. The gods are willing to serve as intermediaries, but we need mortal perspective. Diana, we need the Justice League to participate in first contact." The chamber fell silent. First contact with an entity that had restructured cosmic hierarchy, deprioritized gods and cosmic beings, and converted extinction-level energy into personal resources. An entity that could destroy them, but had chosen not to. An entity that now wanted to talk. "When?" Diana asked. "Now," Athena said. "The anomaly has opened a communication channel through the bleed. Neutral space outside both frameworks. The gods will attend. The monitors have been invited. And you, the representatives of Earth, are requested to participate." "Requested or demanded?" Batman asked. "Requested," Athena confirmed. "The anomaly is extending courtesy. Whether we accept is our choice. But refusing means continuing the current trajectory, where cosmic entities lose authority and the anomaly establishes dominance by default." Superman looked at his teammates. "We need to vote on this." "No," Batman said. "We need to attend. This is the first time the anomaly has initiated contact. The first time it's offered anything other than defensive response. We don't refuse that." "Agreed," Wonder Woman said. "But we go prepared. Full League attendance, and we make it clear we're there for Earth's interests, not as subordinates." The vote was unanimous. The Justice League would attend first contact. Inside imaginary space, Rimuru monitored the responses to his communication signal with interest. The gods had responded immediately, predictable given their awareness of cosmic shifts. The monitors had responded with reluctance, but acceptance. And the Justice League, representing the planetary civilization most directly affected by everything that had happened, had accepted without significant debate. "All major factions have agreed to attend," CL reported. "The meeting space is prepared. Neutral ground in the bleed, equidistant from all parties operating under protocols that allow communication without imposing either framework's physics. Security, Rimuru asked. Absolute. The space exists under our administration. No hostile action is possible without our permission. Participants will be able to communicate, but not attack. And if they interpret that as us having unilateral control, then they interpret correctly. We're offering negotiation, not equality of force. They need to understand the power dynamic before they can accept coexistence terms.
Awesome.
Rimuru considered that. In Tempest, he'd learned that diplomacy required both carrot and stick, the promise of cooperation, backed by the certainty of consequences for aggression. The DC Universe's major powers needed to understand what they were negotiating with before meaningful terms could be established. One more thing, he decided. Before the meeting starts, demonstrate capability one more time. Nothing destructive. Just a reminder that we could have chosen violence and chose negotiation instead. Specification, Ciel asked. Show them the turn null reserves. Full visualization. Let them see exactly how much power they gave us when they deployed crisis energy. Make it clear that coexistence isn't charity, it's choice. Understood. Preparing demonstration for meeting commencement. On Platform Sigma-7, the monitors prepared for a diplomatic session with the kind of reluctance usually reserved for surrender negotiations. Thorakul argued against attendance until the final moment, convinced it was trap or humiliation. But Primus overruled him with simple logic. They had no other options. Every aggressive action had failed. Diplomacy was the only path remaining. Zilovaya prepared with quiet satisfaction. She'd been right from the beginning. Communication over confrontation, understanding over containment. The fact that it had taken catastrophic failure to reach this point didn't diminish her vindication. It just made it bittersweet. In Olympus, the gods assembled with the gravitas of entities facing unprecedented circumstance. Zeus wanted to attend with full divine authority, asserting dominance through sheer presence. Athena counseled restraint. They were attending as participants, not rulers. The distinction mattered to an entity that had just proven it didn't recognize their rulership as absolute. And on Earth, the Justice League prepared with the practical focus of heroes who'd faced cosmic threats before, but never quite like this. Superman packed diplomatic protocols from Kryptonian archives. Wonder Woman consulted with Amazonian scholars on first contact procedures. Batman compiled every piece of data they had on the anomaly into a briefing document that ended with a single conclusion: prepare for anything. The meeting would convene in 6 hours. The cosmic ecosystem continued its collapse not into chaos, but into new order. An order where absolute authority was no longer guaranteed. Where even gods needed permission. Where the hierarchy that had governed reality for eons was being restructured by something that existed outside it while refusing to leave. The multiverse held its breath and waited to learn what terms would be offered for a coexistence nobody had wanted, but everyone now needed. The neutral space materialized in the bleed with geometry that shouldn't have been possible. It existed as a sphere and a plane simultaneously occupying coordinates that registered on instruments from multiple frameworks, while refusing to conform to any single cosmological model. The monitor's technology measured it as a pocket dimension. The gods perceived it as a liminal temple. The Justice League's sensors simply marked it as location undefined, and gave up trying to categorize it further. Inside the chamber was vast without being large, intimate without being confined. The architecture adapted to each participant's perception. Monitors saw crystalline structures that reflected dimensional mathematics gods, saw columns that echoed ancient temples. Humans saw a conference room that wouldn't have been out of place in a corporate headquarters. The space was everything and nothing neutral, by virtue of refusing to be anything specific. At the center, 3 delegations assembled with the careful distance of entities, uncertain whether they were attending negotiation or witnessing execution. The monitors arrived first, primus zillo via dax novu tharakul and novu rel. They positioned themselves in a loose arc, maintaining formation protocols that dated back to the first crisis. Their forms remained translucent, adapting to 7 dimensions, while presenting comprehensible faces to beings limited to 4. Tharakul's posture radiated barely controlled hostility. Zillo Vala stood with the resignation of someone proven right at catastrophic cost. The gods manifested second Athena Hera Hades and Apollo from Olympus. Zeus had wanted to attend, but Athena had persuaded him that restraint demonstrated strength more effectively than presence. They appeared in forms that balanced divine majesty with diplomatic accessibility, powerful enough to command respect, human enough to enable conversation. The Justice League arrived last, teleported into the space by technology that shouldn't have functioned across dimensional barriers, but somehow did. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Cyborg, and Martian Manhunter. 7 mortals facing cosmic entities that had shaped reality before their species evolved. They stood in formation that suggested readiness without aggression, prepared for anything, assuming nothing. And at the far end of the chamber, separated by distance that felt both vast and minimal, a presence made itself known, not through manifestation, not through arrival. It was simply there, in the way fundamental forces were there, observable, measurable, but impossible to properly perceive as discrete entity rather than environmental constant. The space around it distorted in ways the instruments couldn't classify, suggesting depth and complexity that extended into dimensions nobody in the chamber could properly access. Before anyone could speak, the presence acted. The visualization appeared in the center of the chamber, floating in space that all participants could observe from their respective positions. It was a sphere of absolute darkness, not the absence of light, but the presence of void, of primordial nothingness from which anything could be created or into which anything could be unmade. Turn null. The entire reserve made visible. The display showed scale through comparison. 1 unit of turn null was enough to erase a planet from existence across all timelines. 10 units could unmake a solar system. 100 could restructure a galaxy's fundamental physics. The sphere contained enough turn null to potentially unmake and remake significant portions of the DC multiverse. And it had all come from crisis energy that the monitors had deployed. The message was clear without words. You armed me. You gave me the resources to end you, and I chose not to use them. The sphere vanished after exactly 10 seconds. Long enough to be understood, short enough to avoid being interpreted as threat rather than statement of fact. Then words formed in the space not spoken aloud, but transmitted directly into the consciousness of every being present. The communication bypassed language, entirely conveying meaning through pure conceptual transfer in a way that each participant understood in their own framework. I am Rimuru Tempest. I did not choose to come here. I did not ask for your reality's hospitality. But I am here, and my presence is permanent. The question before us is simple. Do we coexist, or do we destroy each other, attempting to establish dominance neither of us actually needs? Tharakul responded before anyone else could speak, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. You've compromised our fundamental systems. You've degraded forces that have operated for millennia. You've restructured cosmic hierarchy without consultation or permission. And you call this coexistence? I call this survival. The response came. Your forces operated with absolute authority that could have overridden my existence. I reduced them to conditional authority to ensure my continued survival. That is defense, not aggression. You attacked first. We attempted containment of an unknown entity that appeared without invitation. Primus set his tone more measured than Tharakul's, but no less firm. Standard protocol for dimensional anomalies. And I responded to that containment attempt by enforcing boundaries you refused to respect. Also standard protocol. The difference is that your protocols assume authority over everything in your reality. Mine assume authority over nothing except what belongs to me. Then why degrade our systems? Dax Novu asked. If you claim no authority over our reality, why compromise the forces that govern it? Because those forces could have been used to compromise me. Rimuru's response carried the weight of someone explaining obvious logic to entities who should have understood it already. Your speed force could negate my temporal coherence. Your magic could rewrite my dimensional structure. Your emotional spectrum could impose states that alter my nature. I reduced them from absolute to conditional, not to attack you, but to ensure you couldn't attack me with guaranteed success. So you admit to weakening us, Tharakul said. I admit to ensuring mutual vulnerability. Before you had the power to potentially destroy me while I posed no threat to your infrastructure. Now we both exist in a state where destruction is possible but not guaranteed. That's not weakness. That's equilibrium. Athena spoke for the first time, her voice carrying divine authority tempered by wisdom. You speak of equilibrium as if it's achieved through imposed limitation. That's not balance. That's control through another name. Would you prefer I destroyed your systems entirely? Rimuru's question wasn't confrontational. It was genuine inquiry. I had the capability after converting your crisis energy. I chose degradation over elimination specifically to preserve your reality's functionality while securing my own existence. You're calling that control. I call it restraint. Hades leaned forward, his form shifting shadows in the neutral light. Restraint implies choice held in reserve. What you're describing is deterrence through mutual vulnerability. The difference matters to gods who've maintained cosmic order through absolute rather than conditional authority. Your cosmic order attempted to cage me, Rimuru said. Twice. It failed both times because your order assumes it has authority over everything that exists in your reality. I'm teaching you that assumption was always false. You just never encountered anything that could prove it false before. Teaching. Hera repeated, her voice sharp with divine pride. You position yourself as instructor to gods and cosmic entities. That's remarkable arrogance from something that's existed in our reality for mere days. It's not arrogance when the lesson is demonstrated fact, rather than theoretical proposition. Your systems aren't absolute anymore. That's not opinion. That's measured reality. Whether you call it teaching or learning is semantic distinction that changes nothing about the actual state of affairs. Batman had been silent throughout the exchange, observing interaction patterns and cataloging responses. He spoke now with a clinical precision that made him effective in situations where emotion was liability. You're right that semantic distinctions don't change facts. So let's establish facts. You exist in our reality. You've altered fundamental forces to ensure your survival. You've demonstrated capacity to destroy, but chosen not to. Those are all facts we can verify. What we can't verify is intent. What do you actually want? The pause before Rimuru's response was long enough to suggest actual consideration rather than prepared answer. Nothing. I want nothing from your reality except to exist in it without being attacked or contained. I have no interest in your resources, your territories, or your cosmic hierarchy. I arrived here accidentally, and I'm making the best of circumstances I didn't choose. Accidentally? Superman said, speaking for the first time. You're asking us to believe an entity powerful enough to restructure reality just happened to appear in our dimension by chance. Yes, Rimuru said simply. Because that's what occurred. I was traveling between dimensions in my own cosmology when something went wrong. I ended up here instead of where I intended to be. Your reality and mine are incompatible at fundamental levels. I've been trying to synchronize my existence with your physics while maintaining my own framework. Everything you've interpreted as aggression has been defensive response to your attempts to eliminate or control that synchronization process. If you want nothing from us, Wonder Woman asked, why not simply leave? Find your way back to your own reality and end this conflict. Because I can't leave until synchronization is complete. And synchronization requires time during which your authorities kept attacking me. The degradation of your systems isn't goal. It's consequence of your aggression. If you'd left me alone, your forces would still be absolute. But you didn't leave me alone. You tried to cage me, then you tried to destroy me with crisis energy. The current state of affairs is result of your choices, not mine. Zillo-Vaya had been watching the exchange with expression that mixed vindication with weariness. She spoke quietly, but every being in the chamber heard her clearly. Everything it's saying is consistent with its observed behavior. It's been reactive, not proactive. Defensive, not aggressive. We escalated at every stage and it responded proportionally. The degradation of our systems is our own fault. You're defending it. Tharakul turned on her with barely controlled fury. I'm stating facts, Zillo-Vaya said. Which is more than you've been willing to do since the situation began. We attacked first. We failed. We attacked again. We failed again. At what point do we accept that we can't solve this through force? When the alternative isn't surrender. Tharakul snapped. The alternative isn't surrender, Rimuru interjected. It's coexistence. I don't want your submission. I don't want your territory. I don't want anything except a complete synchronization and be left alone until I can find my way home. You're the ones who keep treating this as war when it's just unfortunate circumstance affecting all of us. Flash leaned toward Batman and whispered, Is it just me? Or does the cosmic entity that restructured reality sound reasonable? Not just you, Batman murmured back. Which is concerning in different ways than expected. Martian Manhunter, who had been attempting telepathic scan throughout the meeting with complete failure, spoke with unusual gravity. I cannot read its thoughts, but I can sense emotional resonance. It's not lying. The frustration, the weariness, the genuine desire to simply exist without conflict, those are authentic. Whatever this entity is, it's not a conqueror. It's a refugee that's been forced to fight for survival. Apollo, god of prophecy, had been silent until now. He spoke with the weight of someone seeing futures collapse into impossibility. The fates themselves are confused by this entity. I cannot see outcomes with certainty because it exists outside the causal chains that allow prophecy. But I see one thing clearly. If we continue treating it as enemy, we all lose. If we accept coexistence, uncertainty remains, but annihilation does not. "You're counseling surrender based on prophetic ambiguity," Tharakul demanded. "I'm counseling wisdom based on demonstrated reality," Apollo corrected. "We cannot defeat it. We've tried and failed at every level. Continuing to try means either we eventually succeed and potentially destroy ourselves in the process, or we fail repeatedly until it loses patience with our aggression and actually becomes the threat we keep claiming it is." Primus, who had been silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke with the authority of someone making command decision. "We need terms. Specific conditions for coexistence that all parties can verify and enforce." "Agreed," Athena said. "Vague commitment to peaceful coexistence isn't sufficient. We need framework." Rimuru's response came without hesitation, suggesting preparation. "Simple terms. I complete synchronization without further interference from monitors or cosmic entities. Satantis. Timeline approximately 72 hours. During that period, your degraded systems remain stable at current levels. I won't reduce them further if you don't attack me. Once synchronization completes, I begin working to find method to return to my own reality. While I remain in your dimension, I maintain strict non-interference policy. I don't involve myself in your conflicts, your politics, or your cosmic affairs. You extend same courtesy to me." "And if we're attacked by forces you could prevent?" Superman asked. "You maintain non-interference even if we face existential threats?" "Yes. Unless that threat directly involves me or my interests, I don't intervene. That's the cost of sovereignty. You don't get to call on me for help, while also demanding I remain isolated from your reality's affairs." "What about restoration of our systems?" Dax Novu asked. "Once you leave, do our fundamental forces return to absolute authority?" "Unknown," Rimuru admitted. "The changes I've made to priority hierarchies may be permanent even after I depart. Your reality has been exposed to frameworks that operate under different rules. It may never fully return to the state it was in before my arrival. That's unfortunate, but unavoidable. You can't unring a bell once it's been rung." "So we're permanently compromised," Tharakul said bitterly. "You're permanently altered," Rimuru corrected. "Whether that's compromise or adaptation depends on your perspective. Your systems still function. Your reality still exists. You've just learned that absolute authority was never as absolute as you believed." Batman processed the terms with analytical precision. "These terms assume you're being truthful about wanting to leave. If you're lying, if your actual goal is permanent occupation, these terms give you everything you want, while we concede our ability to resist." "If I wanted permanent occupation, I'd have that already," Rimuru said. "You can't actually resist. Not anymore. The turn null reserves I showed you weren't boasts, they're fact. I have the power to remake your reality, and you don't have the power to stop me. These terms aren't negotiation between equals. They're me offering to leave peacefully instead of staying as conqueror. The choice is whether you accept that offer or force me to prove I mean it." The chamber fell silent. The entity was right, and everyone present knew it. The power dynamic wasn't balanced. It never had been. The only reason anyone was still alive, the only reason their reality still functioned, was because Rimuru had chosen restraint over dominance. Accepting the terms wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement of reality. Wonder Woman spoke, her voice carrying Amazon conviction. "These terms require trust. We have no basis for granting. You're asking us to bet our continued existence on your word." "No," Rimuru said. "I'm asking you to bet your continued existence on demonstrated behavior. I've had the power to destroy you since converting your crisis energy. I've had motive. You attacked me repeatedly. I've had opportunity, you can't stop me. Yet you still exist. That's not my word. That's my choice proven through action. Athena nodded slowly. The stranger speaks truth. Actions reveal intent more reliably than promises. It has demonstrated restraint when destruction was easier. That suggests genuine preference for coexistence over conquest. Or sophisticated manipulation, Hera countered. Appearing reasonable while establishing dominance through other means. To what end? Athena asked. If manipulation is goal, what does it gain from appearing reasonable that it couldn't simply take through demonstrated force? Hera had no answer. Cyborg, who had been running probability simulations throughout the meeting, spoke up. I've modeled the scenarios. If we reject these terms and continue resistance, probability of our victory is effectively 0. Probability of escalating conflict that damages reality infrastructure is 97%. If we accept terms, probability of betrayal exists, but is unpredictable. We don't have enough data on this entity's nature to model it accurately. But probability of maintaining stable coexistence for 72 hours is high. And if it actually leaves after that, we've lost nothing except pride. And if it doesn't leave? Tharakul demanded. Then we're exactly where we'd be anyway, if we rejected the terms, Cyborg said. Facing an entity we can't defeat. The difference is whether we face it after demonstrating willingness to coexist or after forcing it to prove dominance through violence. Superman looked at his teammates, then at the cosmic entities assembled. We need to vote. Justice League first, then monitors, then gods. If all 3 factions agree, we accept the terms. If any faction rejects, we... He paused, recognizing the absurdity. We figure out what resistance looks like knowing it can't succeed. The Justice League voted among themselves through silent communication protocols. Batman's analysis said, accept. Wonder Woman's intuition said accept. Even Flash, usually optimistic about fighting impossible odds, recognized this was different. The vote was unanimous. Superman turned to the chamber. The Justice League accepts the proposed terms. The gods conferred through channels mortals couldn't perceive. Zeus's fury echoed through Olympus, demanding resistance, demanding pride. But Athena's wisdom carried more weight in this instance. Apollo's prophecy suggested acceptance. Even Ares, god of war, recognized that some battles couldn't be won through violence. Athena spoke for Olympus. The gods accept the proposed terms. The monitors were last. Their internal deliberation was visible through the flickering of their forms, dimensional structures reflecting internal conflict. Tharakul argued for continued resistance. Dax Novu counseled pragmatism. Novu Rel presented probability cascades that suggested acceptance was only path that didn't end in catastrophic failure. Primus made the final call. The monitors accept the proposed terms, with formal notation that we do so under protest and duress. Noted, Rimuru's response carried hint of amusement. Your protest is recorded for posterity. Now implementation. For the next 72 hours, I complete synchronization. Your systems remain stable at 94%. No interference from either side. After synchronization, I begin research into dimensional transit methods. You provide no assistance, but also no obstruction. When I find a way home, I leave. No goodbyes, no final confrontations, just departure. Until then, we acknowledge each other's existence and otherwise ignore each other. Agreed. Agreed, Primus said. Agreed. Athena confirmed. Agreed, Superman stated. The neutral space began to dissolve, its purpose fulfilled. But before the delegation separated, Rimuru's presence intensified one final time. One more thing. What happened here? The degradation, the restructuring, the change in cosmic hierarchy that's permanent. Even after I leave, your reality won't forget that it was forced to accommodate something outside its frameworks. You'll adapt, or you won't, but you'll never return to the certainty you had before. I'm sorry for that. It wasn't my intention to change your reality so fundamentally. But it's done, and apologies don't undo consequences. Then the presence withdrew, and the neutral space collapsed completely. The delegations returned to their respective realms in silence, each processing what had just occurred. They'd attended expecting negotiation. What they'd received was acknowledgement of defeat, presented as diplomatic courtesy. DC had admitted there was no win condition, and in that admission, they'd chosen survival over pride. The multiverse would endure, changed, diminished in some ways, but enduring nonetheless. And somewhere in the bleed, an entity named Rimuru Tempest continued the synchronization process that would hopefully allow him to go home, leaving behind a reality that would never be quite the same. The 72 hours passed without incident. No attacks, no provocations, no desperate final gambits from entities who couldn't accept the new order. The DC multiverse held its collective breath and watched as something fundamentally other completed the process of synchronization that would theoretically allow it to leave. Rimuru worked methodically through the final integration stages, calibrating imaginary space to interface with DC's dimensional architecture without compromising its independence. CL handled the technical details with precision that made quantum mechanics look approximate, ensuring every connection point was stable, every protocol verified, every safeguard in place. Synchronization complete, she reported on the 71st hour. We can now exist in this reality indefinitely without degradation or interference. Imaginary space is fully integrated with local dimensional topology while maintaining operational independence. And dimensional transit, Rimuru asked. Still researching. This reality's multiverse operates on principles fundamentally different from our origin cosmology. Standard transit methods won't work. I'm analyzing their bleed structure for potential adaptation, but it may take weeks or months to develop reliable departure mechanism. Rimuru had expected that answer. Dimensional travel was never simple, especially between cosmologies that operated under incompatible physical laws. But the research would continue, and eventually he'd find a way home. He always did. In the meantime, there was a promise to keep. On the 72nd hour, Rimuru began the restoration process. Not complete restoration, he'd been clear that some changes were permanent. But he could return functionality to levels closer to what they'd been before his arrival. The degraded systems didn't need to stay at 94% forever. The Speed Force was first. Rimuru couldn't restore its absolute authority that would require rewriting fundamental aspects of his own existence to be subordinate to DC's framework, which wasn't happening. But he could remove the friction he'd imposed for defensive purposes. The lag times could be reduced. The resistance could be minimized. In Central City, Barry Allen was responding to a robbery when he felt the change. The Speed Force connection, which had been operating with perceptible delay for weeks, suddenly smoothed out. Not completely, there was still slight resistance that hadn't existed before. But the difference between 94% and 98% was enough to feel like relief. "Wally," he said into his comm, "are you feeling this?" "Yeah." Wally's voice came back from Keystone. "The Force just got easier. Not back to normal, but close enough that I'm not fighting it anymore." Barry tested his limits carefully. Phasing through solid matter took 0.004 seconds instead of 0.012. Not instantaneous like before, but close enough for any practical application. The speed force would never again be absolute. That door had closed permanently. But it could be functional in ways that didn't require constant adjustment. He'd take it. The emotional spectrum received similar treatment. Rimuru couldn't restore the Guardian's absolute control over willpower-based reality manipulation. That level of authority conflicted with his own framework's priority. But he could reduce the response time delays, smooth out the efficiency drops, make the rings respond with something approaching their original reliability. On Oa, the central power battery's efficiency climbed from 94 to 97%. The Guardians monitored the change with cautious relief. They'd lost absolute authority, yes, but they'd retained enough functionality to continue their mission. The core could still operate. The universe could still be protected. It wasn't what they'd had, but it was enough to work with. Magic proved more complex. The arcane forces that governed spell casting and ritual work didn't just rely on imposed will. They relied on narrative causality, on symbolic meaning, on the kind of reality warping that operated through story logic rather than physics. Rimuru couldn't restore those systems without compromising his own independence from narrative frameworks. But he could partition them, create spaces where magic operated with higher priority zones, where spells functioned closer to their original efficiency. The Rock of Eternity, Themyscira. The House of Mystery, these locations received localized restoration that brought magical efficiency up to 96% within their boundaries. Satana felt the change during a working in the House of Mystery. The spell she was casting, which had been requiring careful compensation for lag and uncertainty, suddenly clicked into place with something approaching the old reliability. Not perfect, not absolute, but functional. The anomaly kept its word, she said to the empty room. It's giving back what it can. In the bleed, the monitors watched the restoration with mixed feelings. Relief that their systems were becoming more functional. Resentment that the restoration was being granted rather than reclaimed. And underneath both the uncomfortable awareness that they were only receiving this courtesy because Rimuru chose to grant it. Systems climbing to 97 to 98% across all metrics, Roxtal reported. The anomaly is fulfilling its commitment to restoration. Partial restoration, Tharakul corrected bitterly. We'll never return to pre-contact status. No, Zilovala agreed. But we'll adapt. That's what the multiverse does. It adapts to new realities because refusing to adapt leads to extinction. Dax Novu studied the restoration patterns with growing understanding. It's being strategic about what it restores. Systems that operate purely through imposed will remain more degraded. Systems that work with natural law receive higher restoration. It's incentivizing cooperation with physical reality over domination of it. It's teaching us, Novu Rel said quietly, showing us that absolute authority was always less stable than collaborative function. The lesson is subtle, but it's there. I hate that you're right, Tharakul said. I hate that we're being lectured on cosmology by an entity that's existed here for barely a week. Then hate it productively, Primus said, speaking for the first time since the meeting. Learn from the lesson instead of resenting the teacher. We built our entire civilization on the assumption that authority over reality was our right. That assumption was disproven. We can either adapt our thinking or remain bitter while the universe moves forward without us. The dark multiverse received no restoration. Its corruption vectors remained deprioritized, its ability to spawn nightmare realities neutralized. Barbatos, imprisoned in the World Forge, felt no change in his diminished state. The darkness that had been his to command remained distant, conditional subordinate to frameworks that didn't recognize his authority. The difference was that Rimuru's lack of restoration here was deliberate policy rather than limited capability. The dark multiverse's entire function was to corrupt stable realities into failed versions. Restoring that capability would actively harm the very cosmology Rimuru was trying to peacefully coexist with. So it stayed neutralized, permanently. The monitor assigned to observe the dark multiverse's containment noted the decision with approval. The anomaly is demonstrating discernment. It's not restoring systems indiscriminately, it's making value judgments about which functions should return and which shouldn't. Value judgments, Zillow repeated. That's sovereignty. It's deciding what kind of reality we get to have based on its assessment of what's healthy for the ecosystem. And we're accepting that because the alternative is worse, Dax Novu said. Which means it was right during the meeting. We didn't lose authority, we just learned it was never as absolute as we believed. The anti-monitor remnants received minimal restoration, enough that they could maintain coherent existence, but not enough to reform into genuine threat. Antimatter responded to their will with slight improvement, but nothing approaching the absolute command they'd once wielded. In the antimatter universe, the fragments that constituted the anti-monitor's distributed consciousness processed the change with something that would have been resignation if they still possessed unified sentience. They'd been cosmological force terror that could unmake universes. Now, they were barely coherent remnants maintained in stable diminishment by an entity that had proven itself superior without needing to prove anything at all. The humiliation was absolute. But existence continued, diminished but continuous. And in that continuation, there was at least the possibility of eventual recovery, even if it would take eons. Perpetua's echo received no restoration. It remained isolated in the sixth dimension, unable to influence the dimensional structures it had once shaped according to will. The echo wasn't conscious enough to experience frustration, but the entities monitoring it could see the degradation. What had been growing stronger was now locked in static state, neither advancing nor dissipating. Frozen. Neutralized. Irrelevant. The anomaly is rewriting cosmic hierarchy with precision, the sixth dimension's guardian observed. It's not destroying threats, it's rendering them obsolete. That's more permanent than destruction, because it doesn't create martyrs or allow for resurrection myths. On Earth, the Justice League convened one final time to assess the new normal. Superman stood at the head of the conference table in the watchtower, reviewing reports from every major system that had been affected by the changes. Speed Force is functional at approximately 98%, Seman, he summarized. Not perfect, but close enough that speedsters can operate normally with minor adjustment to techniques. Emotional spectrum is similar, Green Lantern added. 97% efficiency. The ring's work constructs hold, the corpse can continue its mission. We've lost absolute authority but retained operational capability. Magic is complicated. Zatanna reported via video link. 96% in consecrated spaces, lower elsewhere. Practitioners will need to work harder for the same results, but it's not crippling. We adapt or we retire, and I'm not ready to retire. The gods report similar patterns? Wonder Woman said. Divine authority is diminished, but not eliminated. They can still act, still influence, still protect their domains. Just not with the certainty they once possessed. Batman pulled up the comprehensive analysis he'd been compiling. Pattern is clear. Systems that operate cooperatively with natural law retained higher function. Systems that operated through imposed dominance were more heavily degraded. It's not random. It's philosophical statement about how power should function. And we're just accepting that, Flash asked. An entity from another reality gets to lecture us on how our power structures should operate. We're accepting it because it demonstrated that our power structures were vulnerable to precisely the kind of challenge it represents, Batman said. If absolute authority could be deprioritized by something operating under different rules, then it was never actually absolute. It was just unchallenged until now. That's terrifyingly pragmatic, Flash said. That's Batman, Superman said with slight smile. Then more seriously, the question is what we do going forward. The anomaly says it's working on finding a way home. Do we help hinder or ignore? Ignore, Wonder Woman said immediately. We agreed to non-interference. That means we don't involve ourselves in its affairs, including its departure research. It solves its own problem, or it doesn't. And if it can't leave, Cyborg asked, if this becomes permanent presence rather than temporary displacement, then we coexist, Superman said. Same terms. It doesn't involve itself in our conflicts. We don't involve ourselves in its existence. Two frameworks occupying the same reality, maintaining strict boundaries. That's unprecedented, Green Lantern said. This entire situation is unprecedented, Batman pointed out. We're establishing protocols as we go because there's no template for this. But the core principle is sound. Maintain boundaries, avoid provocation, accept the new normal, and adapt to it. The League voted. Unanimous agreement on non-interference policy. Whatever Rimuru was doing in the bleed to research dimensional transit, it would do without their help or hindrance. Inside imaginary space, Rimuru completed the restoration protocols and reviewed the results. Systems were stable at high functionality. The DC multiverse could operate effectively, even with the permanent changes he'd imposed. The ecosystem he'd disrupted was finding new equilibrium. How's the transit research progressing? He asked Sael. Slowly. The bleed structure is comprehensible, but not easily navigable for beings from our cosmology. I'm developing translation protocols that might allow dimensional transit, but testing will be dangerous. We could end up in wrong universe again, or worse, between universes with no anchor points. Timeline estimate? Optimistic 2 months. Realistic 6 months. Pessimistic, we may need to find alternative method entirely if bleed adaptation proves impossible. Rimuru settled into patient observation mode. He'd been displaced before back when he was still learning to control his abilities in the Tensura universe. He'd learned that panicked action caused more problems than patient planning. If it took months to find safe road home, he'd wait months. The DC universe wasn't hostile anymore, just wary. He could exist here without conflict as long as he maintained the boundaries he'd established. Continue research, he instructed. No rushed experiments. We test thoroughly before attempting actual transit. I'd rather spend a year here getting it right than spend eternity lost between dimensions getting it wrong. Understood. Research will proceed at maximum safety margins. Weeks passed, then months. The DC universe adapted to its new reality with remarkable resilience. Speedsters learned to work with 98% efficiency and stopped noticing the difference. Lanterns adapted their construct techniques to account for slight delays. Magic practitioners developed new methods that worked within the constraints of diminished absolute authority. The cosmic entities were slower to adapt, but adapt they did. The monitors restructured their observation protocols to account for the reality that their authority was conditional. The gods adjusted their interventions to work within bounds that acknowledged other sovereignties besides their own. The dark multiverse remained neutralized. Barbatos remained diminished. The anti-monitor remnants remained irrelevant. And Perpetua's echo remained frozen. These were the permanent scars, the changes that would never reverse the prices that had been paid for cosmic entities learning that absolute authority was myth rather than truth. On the 6-month anniversary of Rimuru's arrival, CL completed the transit research. I've developed a viable route back to our origin cosmology. Confidence level 83%. Risk of catastrophic displacement 14%. Risk of successful return 69%. Those aren't great odds, Rimuru observed. They're the best odds available given the fundamental incompatibility between cosmologies. We can wait for better solution, but my projections suggest these odds won't significantly improve even with additional research time. Rimuru thought about Tempest, about Shion Benimaru Shuna, all the citizens who were continuing their lives in his absence, about the responsibilities he'd left behind, and the reality he actually belonged in. 6 months was long enough. It was time to try going home, even if the attempt carried significant risk. Prepare for departure, he decided. We'll attempt transit in 72 hours. That gives time for final preparations and allows us to notify the local authorities that we're leaving. Notification is not required by the coexistence terms, CL pointed out. No. But it's courteous. And courtesy costs nothing, while potentially preventing misunderstandings. The notification went out through the same channels that had been used for the original meeting. Simple message: departure attempt scheduled. If successful, imaginary space will detach from this reality completely. If unsuccessful, status quo continues and alternative methods will be researched. The monitors received the notification with relief. Zilovaya with satisfaction. Thara Kul with lingering resentment, but acknowledgement that this outcome was preferable to alternatives. The gods received it with mixed feelings. They'd grown accustomed to diminished authority, learned to work within new constraints. Rimuru's departure wouldn't restore what they'd lost. Those changes were permanent, but it would remove the entity that represented the paradigm shift they were still processing. The Justice League received it with professional interest and slight apprehension. Batman immediately began calculating probabilities of what unsuccessful departure might mean for Earth's safety. Superman hoped for successful transit while preparing contingencies for failure. Wonder Woman consulted with Athena about whether the gods should offer blessing for the journey. They decided against it. Non-interference meant non-interference. Rimuru would succeed or fail on its own merits without divine intervention in either direction. On the designated hour, Rimuru activated the transit sequence CL had developed. Imaginary space began detaching from DC's dimensional topology, severing the connection points that had been established over 6 months of synchronization. The process was gradual, methodical, reversing the integration that had allowed coexistence. In the bleed monitors registered the separation. The anomaly's signature, which had become familiar fixture in their readings, began fading. Not vanishing, fading, as if moving away through dimensions that couldn't be properly tracked. The separation completed. Imaginary space existed for one final moment at the boundary between realities, neither fully in DC's cosmology nor fully departed from it. Then it was gone. The instruments confirmed departure. The space where the anomaly had existed showed no trace of its presence beyond the permanent changes it had imposed on reality's architecture. Crisis energy that had been converted to turn null didn't spontaneously reappear. Speed Force efficiency didn't climb back to 100%. Magic didn't regain absolute authority. The scars remained, permanent, indelible. Proof that something from outside had touched DC's reality and left it fundamentally altered. But the entity itself was gone. In the watchtower, alarms stayed silent. No dimensional breaches, No reality fractures. No catastrophic consequences of the departure. Just absence where presence had been, and the quiet recognition that the multiverse would never be quite what it was before. "It's really gone," Flash said, staring at the readings. "Yes," Batman confirmed. "Do you think it made it home?" "Unknown. But given its demonstrated capability, probability suggests success. And if it didn't? If it's lost somewhere between realities?" Batman was quiet for a moment. "Then that's no longer our concern. Non-interference applies to its successes and its failures equally." Superman looked at his teammates. "We survived. That's what matters. We survived contact with something that could have destroyed us, learned from it, and continued existing. The multiverse has faced worse." "Has it, though?" Wonder Woman asked quietly. "We've faced threats that wanted to destroy us. This was something that just wanted to exist, and we nearly destroyed ourselves, trying to prevent that. I'm not sure which scenario reflects worse on us." Before anyone could respond, the cosmic monitoring stations registered a final anomaly. Brief, localized, gone within seconds. A message transmitted through the same pure conceptual transfer that Rimuru had used during the meeting. Every being with cosmic awareness received it simultaneously. "Thank you for coexistence. I'm sorry for the permanent changes. Your reality is stronger than you know it will adapt and endure. Remember that absolute authority was always illusion. Wisdom lies in recognizing that truth before it's proven through catastrophe. Safe journeys." Then silence. Complete. Final. The DC multiverse continued its existence. Scarred. Changed. Diminished in some ways, perhaps stronger in others. But enduring as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in the bleed, in the space between dimensions where the anomaly had resided for 6 months, there remained only echoes, mathematical ghosts in the architecture. Slight distortions in reality's fabric that would take millennia to fade completely. The scar remained. And in that scar, the memory of something that had existed outside framework, refused to be contained, and chosen coexistence over conquest. The lesson was written into the multiverse's structure now. Permanent, unavoidable. Absolute authority was myth. Coexistence was necessity. And adaptation was the only path to survival. The crisis was over. The universe endured. And DC learned that sometimes the most fundamental threat isn't the one that wants to destroy you. It's the one that forces you to question everything you thought you knew about power, authority, and what it means to control reality itself. That lesson would echo through the ages, long after the entity that taught it had returned to wherever it came from. The scar remained, and the multiverse was forever changed.